Hello, fellow sapiens, and a warm welcome to Midnight Sapien. Whether you are lying back and spiraling softly towards sleep, walking under quiet streetlights with headphones, or simply filling a calm moment in your day, this space is for you. Because tonight, we turn our attention to the entire history of human voices, tracing how sound itself carried us into being. This is calm storytelling and slow science. It is an untold chronicle of voices stretching across 2 million years, echoing through silence, carried on wind, and shaped in firelight. A story where time itself becomes an instrument, and where breath became the first music. But the story is not a simple timeline of words emerging. It begins not with speech, but with echoes, with grunts, with songs of air and bone that hinted at language long before language was born. And, you know, if you are the kind of thoughtful human who enjoys sinking into long, quiet journeys of deep history, consider tapping like and subscribe. It helps this kind of gentle storytelling find more sapiens who crave the same peace and wonder. I often wonder where this voice is reaching you. Where are you listening from? What time is it for you right now? If you feel like sharing, leave a note in the comments, a reminder that we are listening together across distances. Also, if sleep arrives, let it. The chapters and timestamps are waiting in the description. And now, our story begins with a sound that became a symbol. To imagine the beginning of the human voice, we must travel back almost 2 million years. The landscape is African Savannah, stretching in waves of yellow grasses and scattered acacia trees beneath a heavy sun. Here, bands of early hominins moved restlessly, seeking food, water, and safety. They were not yet us, but they were close enough that their shadows would eventually lengthen into ours. Their bodies were taller and stronger than the smaller apes that came before them, and their brains, though still limited in volume compared to our own, were expanding into new frontiers of possibility. Among these hominins were species like Homo erectus, whose very name means upright human. They were walkers of distance, able to stride across continents. They carried stone tools, simple yet effective, and with them they shaped bones, cracked nuts, and butchered meat. But perhaps the most profound tool they carried was invisible. It was the capacity of their lungs and throats to push air, to create sound, to fill the savannah with vibrations that others could hear. These sounds were not yet words. They were grunts, cries, and sharp bursts of rhythm. But they mattered. A sudden call could signal danger, the rustle of a predator hidden in tall grass. A low grunt could communicate irritation or claim a piece of food. A plaintive cry could draw a mother's attention back to her wandering child. Even without language, sound was survival. The anatomy of these early humans hints at why. Compared to Australopithecus, their more ancient relatives, Homo erectus had larger chest cavities, broader diaphragms, and greater lung capacity. Breath could be sustained for longer. Control over exhalation was improving. And though their vocal tracts were still more limited than ours, they had begun to shape air in ways that went beyond simple primate calls. This was not yet speech, but it was a rehearsal for it. Across the savannah, sound was also a bond. Just as modern primates use specific alarm calls for snakes, leopards, or eagles, early humans almost certainly had distinctions embedded in their cries. Archaeologists cannot replay those lost voices, but comparisons with chimpanzees and bonobos provide clues. They remind us that even without syntax, a grunt paired with a gesture or a glance could carry enough meaning to influence behavior. And here lies the quiet miracle. Communication does not need full language to function. It needs breath, body, and recognition. In the mouths of Homo erectus, air was already becoming a medium of memory and survival. Around a kill site, shared cries could coordinate movement, some guarding the edges while others stripped the bones. By a watering hole, warning shouts could scatter a group before crocodiles lunged. In the night, soft hums or rhythmic breathing might soothe restless children to sleep. This was the breath before words. A symphony of raw sounds, each carrying intention but not yet locked into the intricate cages of grammar. In these early voices, the future of language was suspended, waiting to take shape. This fragile beginning raises a question. How did the breath of early hominins, raw and unshaped, begin to prepare the ground for the vast complexity of human speech? The answer lies not only in the throat, but in the slow transformation of the body itself. Fossil evidence shows that Homo erectus stood taller and more balanced than their predecessors. Their ribcage and pelvis supported a stride built for endurance, and this endurance shaped their breath. Unlike apes that move in bursts of climbing or short sprints, erectus became a walker of horizons. To walk and run long distances requires control of breathing. A steady exhale, a measured inhale, a rhythm that can be maintained for hours. Out of this rhythm came an entirely new relationship between lungs and communication. Breath was no longer only survival. It became a resource that could be directed towards sound. Australopithecus, the earlier hominin genus, had already begun this shift, but their vocal tracts were shorter, their cranial bases less flexed, and their capacity for varied resonance more limited. Homo erectus pushed further. Their throats lengthened slightly. Their skulls began to angle in ways that opened acoustic possibilities. Scholars debate how much this anatomy allowed speech-like sounds, but consensus holds that they were stepping into a liminal zone. They did not yet speak as we do, yet they were no longer bound entirely to the calls of other primates. Imagine a night on the Savannah, 2 million years ago. A small fire flickers, its flames guarded against the wind. Around it sit figures with heavy brows and strong limbs. The children are restless, eyes glinting in the glow. A mother exhales a rhythmic hum. It is not a word, not a song, yet it calms the child. The group feels the sound together, a vibration stitched into their shared breathing. This scene is speculative, but it is rooted in physiology. Controlled exhalation, shaped into repeated sound, is one of the most basic bridges from breathing into vocal communication. Archaeologists cannot retrieve voices from fossils, but indirect evidence surrounds us. Studies of breath control in modern humans reveal that our speech requires precise timing between lungs, larynx, and lips. Without this delicate coordination, words collapse. The evolutionary groundwork for that coordination had to begin early. The rhythmic breathing of long-distance running, the shared panting of group hunts, the vocal play of grunts and cries, all of these were rehearsals. Even today, echoes of this deep past remain. Infants babble long before they form words, testing lungs and throats with streams of sound. Their breath is playful, experimental, unbound by syntax. Something similar may have unfolded among early Homo erectus. Their cries and grunts were not yet symbolic, but they were practice. They stretched the capacity of breath and throat, creating a range that future generations would inherit. From these experiments, meaning began to accumulate. A certain grunt paired with pointing toward a tree might mark fruit. A sharp cry might consistently warn of predators. These were not words in the full sense, but they were anchors. Repetition tethered sound to context. Breath was slowly becoming language. Over many generations, these anchors deepened. The sound itself was still rough, but its association grew sharper, carried by memory and repetition. Breath became more than air. It became a signal that lived between minds. Consider the hunt. A group of Homo erectus fanning across the savannah needed coordination. One individual's sharp bark could drive prey in a certain direction. Another's sustained cry could summon others forward. Coordination without words was possible, but with breath and sound, it became easier, quicker, and more efficient. Survival favored those who could make their voices matter. The same was true in child-rearing. Infants of erectus were born more helpless than apes, a cost of evolving larger brains. They required longer care. Cries ensured attention, not just from mothers, but from the whole group. A child's breath summoned protection. In this way, the survival of the young was braided into the vocal life of the group. Modern research into primate communication suggests that many species already distinguish types of calls for different threats. Monkeys, for example, vary their alarms depending on whether danger comes from the sky or from the ground. It is reasonable to believe that early Homo did something similar, but with more variety, more strength, and more coordination. Their anatomy gave them louder voices, more sustained cries, and wider ranges of pitch. The result was not yet language, but it was a growing symphony of signals. We cannot hear them now, but we can trace them in echoes. Fossil skulls reveal the broadening of cranial bases, suggesting space for greater resonance. Stone tools tell of cooperation, which required communication of some form. Burned bones at ancient hearths suggest gatherings, where sound might have taken on ritual or rhythmic forms. All these fragments point toward the same truth. Long before words, there was the breath before words. This stage lasted for hundreds of thousands of years. It was not quick. Evolution moves slowly, and the shaping of the human voice was no different. Each generation carried the small changes forward, some physical, others cultural. Lungs grew stronger, throats more flexible. Habits of sound passed from mother to child, from elder to young. Over time, sound became expectation. A grunt was not only noise, it was communication, bound to memory. If we could stand among them, we would not understand. Their sounds would strike our ears as strange, without structure, raw and untranslatable. Yet we would recognize the intention. We would feel the urgency in warning cries, the comfort in low hums, the command in sharp barks. These were the beginnings of the voice. Not yet words, but the soil in which words would grow. Breath, once tied only to the mechanics of survival, had begun to cross into meaning. It carried the seeds of a future where language would unfold. The lungs of Homo erectus, the throats of Australopithecus, the cries of children in the grasslands, all of them were instruments in rehearsal. Each sound, raw and unshaped, was a fragment of the long journey toward voices that could hold memory, story, and thought. The fragments of sound that began to anchor, meaning gradually expanded into something larger. Out on the savannah, where open horizons left little room for hiding, the voice became an early shield. A sharp cry, cutting across the grasslands, could change the course of survival in an instant. Alarm calls were among the most powerful of these signals. When a predator approached, sound travelled faster than gesture. A sudden, piercing note warned the group before eyes could even locate the threat. In the fossil record, we cannot hear those alarms, but modern primates remind us how specific such cries can be. Vervet monkeys, for example, issue distinct calls for eagles, snakes, and leopards, each triggering a different escape response. It is reasonable to imagine early Homo species producing their own set of graded signals, each sharpened by repetition, each tied to survival in the vast grasslands of Africa. Territory also found its voice. Groups of Homo erectus ranged widely, following game and seasonal rains. The land was both opportunity and competition. Just as gibbons mark their forests with long calls, early humans likely used loud cries and rhythmic shouts to claim their presence. Such sounds did not need to form words. The force of the lungs, the resonance of the chest, the rhythm of repetition, these were enough to declare ownership of space. In open landscapes, where sound carried far, the voice was an extension of the body. Mother and child communication added another layer. Infants were fragile and needed constant attention. A cry was both a plea and a beacon, ensuring protection. Mothers answered with soothing tones, low hums that calmed and reassured. This interplay was not yet language, but it was a dialogue. Modern studies show that human infants are uniquely responsive to pitch, rhythm, and tone, traits that may have deep evolutionary roots. The first conversations between mother and child were measured not in words but in breath, rhythm, and the reassurance of sound. As groups grew larger, these vocal interactions multiplied. Calls were layered with gestures, with glances, with movements of hands and heads. Together, they formed complex webs of communication. The savannah demanded such complexity. Open grasslands exposed dangers quickly, but also allowed information to travel far. A shout could rally hunters across a ridge. A call could scatter foragers before a charging animal. Sound stitched individuals into a collective, binding them to one another in the face of constant uncertainty. Archaeological finds at sites like Olorgesailie in Kenya reveal vast landscapes where Homo erectus crafted tools and hunted in groups. The sheer scale of cooperation implied in these sites suggests systems of communication robust enough to coordinate many individuals. Words were not yet spoken, but signals, grunts, calls, cries were sufficient to shape coordinated action. The voice of the savannah was not a story told in sentences. It was a chorus of signals, each carrying urgency, comfort, or command. Over countless generations, this chorus laid the foundation for the richer patterns that would one day become language. Over time, these signals became more elaborate. The savannah was never silent, and within its constant backdrop of wind, insects, and animal cries, the human voice had to carve out its own distinct place. A call that was too soft vanished into the air. One that was too harsh risked startling the group or losing nuance. The shaping of sound became a balancing act, one that required precision and practice. This balancing act can still be observed in our closest living relatives. Chimpanzees use pant hoots, long sequences of calls that grow in volume and intensity to rally others or to assert dominance. Bonobos employ high-pitched peeps and squeaks, sometimes layered with gestures, to negotiate social relationships. These behaviors suggest that early Homo did something similar, experimenting with pitch, rhythm, and duration to give signals more variety. In doing so, they created the raw materials from which language would eventually emerge. The savannah itself enforced this experimentation. Open environments required sounds that could travel far without losing meaning. Short, sharp bursts worked well for immediate alarms, but longer cries or repeated patterns were needed to maintain contact across distances. Hunters who pursued prey over kilometers of open grasslands likely relied on these repeated calls, each one guiding and aligning the group. For the mothers of young children, subtlety was just as important as strength. A sharp call could protect, but a gentle hum could soothe. The interplay of intensity and calmness became a defining trait of human sound. This duality remains in our voices today. We raise our tone in urgency, but we lower it to comfort. Both extremes share their ancestry in the survival strategies of early Homo. Archaeologists cannot excavate sound, but they can infer it through context. Stone tool scatters, concentrations of animal bones, and evidence of controlled fire reveal situations where large groups gathered. In such places, silence would have been rare. The logistics of sharing food, keeping watch, and caring for children required constant exchange. Not of words, but of signals that carried immediate meaning. These signals also carried emotion. The crack of a branch at night might produce a cascade of alarm cries, each infused with fear. A successful hunt might ignite rhythmic calls of triumph, echoing across the plains. Sound was not just information. It was feeling projected into the air, binding the group through shared states of mind. In this way, the savannah became not only a landscape of survival, but also a stage for the first performances of the human voice. As generations passed, the layering of calls, cries, and tones formed patterns. Some became reliable, expected, and nearly conventional. A sound linked to danger repeated often enough that its association hardened into collective memory. This was not yet vocabulary, but it was close. Memory and repetition gave breath a new dimension, one that edged towards symbolic thought. When repetition solidifies into memory, the boundary between instinct and intention begins to blur. What started as an urgent cry of fear could, over time, become a patterned call that evoked danger even before danger was visible. The savannah encouraged this layering of meaning. Each sound was tested against the demands of life, and those that worked were carried forward. Mother-child communication shows this process in miniature. The infant's cry was initially a reflex, a signal of distress. But for the mother, patterns within those cries soon became recognizable. Some were sharp and urgent, demanding immediate attention. Others were softer, drawn out, suggesting hunger or fatigue. By answering with specific tones of her own soothing hums, rhythmic vocalizations, she began to create a feedback loop. Over thousands of generations, these exchanges refined the sensitivity of both parent and child to vocal nuance. This sensitivity became one of the most essential tools of human social life. Territorial signals, too, evolved through this same repetition. The cry that once startled an intruder came to serve as a declaration of presence even before conflict arose. Repeated over time, such calls created an auditory boundary that other groups could recognize. The Savannah, open and far-reaching, made sound one of the most effective ways to mark space without physical confrontation. Modern studies of primates reveal similar behaviors. Chimpanzees in Gombe use loud calls to signal their position across kilometers of forest. Early Homo likely harnessed the same principle, their deeper lungs and stronger chests producing sounds that carried even further. These vocal behaviors were not isolated. They intertwined with gesture, posture, and gaze. A cry of alarm combined with pointing transformed into a more precise message. A territorial call paired with upright stance became more intimidating. The Savannah demanded integration of body and voice, fusing sound with action. The result was a form of communication more flexible than instinct alone, yet not as structured as language. The importance of this stage is profound. It shows that the path toward language did not leap from silence into words. It was a gradual weaving of signals, shaped by the pressures of survival. Alarm calls taught humans to distinguish threats. Territorial cries taught them to project authority across distance. Mother-child exchanges taught them the emotional weight of tone. These building blocks became the scaffolding upon which language would later rise. Even now, the echoes of that scaffolding remain. The urgent shout that makes us turn our heads, the soothing tone that calms a child, the loud call that claims attention in a crowded space. All of these are relics of the Savannah. They remind us that before we spoke in sentences, we sang in signals, and those signals carried us across the fragile threshold between survival and meaning. The echoes of those signals did more than shape behavior. They gradually molded the body itself, carving pathways that allowed the voice to become more versatile than ever before. Across deep time, the anatomy of hominins shifted in subtle but significant ways, creating the conditions for a range of sounds unlike any other species on Earth. One of the most important changes was the descent of the larynx. In most primates, the larynx sits high in the throat, which allows them to breathe and swallow simultaneously, but limits the variety of sounds they can produce. Early hominins shared this high position. Over hundreds of thousands of years, however, the larynx began to settle lower in the neck. This change created a longer vocal tract, increasing the number of distinct resonant frequencies the human voice could produce. In other words, it expanded the palette of sound. Fossil evidence helps us trace this transformation. Skulls of Homo heidelbergensis, who lived around 600,000 years ago, show a more flexed cranial base than earlier species. This flexion is not trivial. It reshaped the airway, allowing for a greater variety of vowel-like sounds. While we cannot know the exact voices of these ancient humans, the anatomical evidence suggests they had the physical potential to approach the diversity of sound later used by Homo sapiens. Breath control was another foundation. Long before words were spoken, the ability to sustain exhalation became crucial. The demands of endurance hunting, which required persistence over great distances, trained the lungs for steady release of air. This skill translated directly into vocal control. Modern speech depends on the careful rationing of breath, stretching a single exhale into long phrases. The groundwork for this ability was laid by bodies that had learned to run under the heat of African suns. The reshaping of the vocal tract also interacted with the brain. Neural pathways controlling fine motor movements of the tongue, lips, and jaw expanded over time. These areas are among the most densely represented in the motor cortex of modern humans. The seeds of this specialization appear early in the fossil record. Even in Homo erectus, stone tool-making required precision of hand and finger, a coordination likely mirrored in the development of vocal articulation. Comparisons with other primates highlight just how unusual these changes were. Chimpanzees and gorillas remain restricted in the range of vowel-like sounds they can produce. Their vocal tracts are simply not shaped for the flexibility of human speech. The evolutionary reshaping of the human airway, skull base, and breathing apparatus created an entirely new instrument. It was as if evolution had been tuning a windpipe across millennia, refining it until it could hold an orchestra of sound. These changes did not happen overnight. They were gradual, layered into generations. But by the time Homo heidelbergensis walked the earth, the anatomy for speech was largely in place. The stage was set. Breath, sound, and body were converging into the possibility of true language. What remained was not just the structure, but the refinement of how that structure was used. The vocal tract is an instrument, but even the finest instrument requires control before it can produce music. Over time, evolutionary pressures honed this control, weaving together anatomy, breath, and social need. Homo heidelbergensis, often seen as a bridge between earlier Homo erectus and later species like Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, provides one of the clearest windows into this process. Fossils from sites such as Cabwe in Zambia and Atapuerca in Spain reveal cranial bases angled in ways that allow us to infer a vocal tract capable of producing a wide range of sounds. The lowered larynx and expanded pharyngeal cavity created a resonance chamber. Air moving through this chamber could be shaped into sounds more varied than those of earlier hominins. The implications are profound. With a wider palette of sounds came the potential for more complex systems of communication. A call no longer had to be a simple cry of alarm. It could be modulated, elongated, or shifted in pitch, giving it layers of nuance. Even if the full structure of language had not yet emerged, the capacity for variation created the raw material upon which language would later build. Breath control continued to be essential. Endurance running, persistence hunting, and coordinated movement across landscapes demanded lungs that could maintain steady rhythms. This physical training shaped vocal ability. Just as a modern singer draws upon lung capacity developed through training, early humans carried the imprint of their survival strategies into their voices. A steady, controlled exhale could support longer calls, while bursts of power could send alarms echoing across valleys. The skull also told its story. The flexion of the cranial base changed the relationship between the oral and nasal cavities, increasing the range of vowels. Vowels are the foundation of speech, the open sounds that form the core of every spoken language. Without them, communication would be limited to a narrow set of consonant-like noises. The ability to shape air into vowels marked a crucial threshold, one that separated the voices of Homo heidelbergensis from those of their primate relatives. Neural development kept pace with these anatomical shifts. Fossil endocasts suggest expansions in areas of the brain linked to motor control and auditory processing. The fine-tuned coordination of tongue, lips, and throat required not only physical capacity, but also cognitive precision. As these systems grew more sophisticated, the boundary between signal and symbol began to thin. In this way, the human body became a workshop for sound. Bones, muscles, lungs, and brain circuits were refined together, each adjusting to the demands of the others. It was not one feature that created the human voice, but the interplay of many, shaped across hundreds of thousands of years. By the time early Homo sapiens appeared in Africa, around 300,000 years ago, this workshop had produced an instrument unmatched in the natural world. The arrival of early Homo sapiens marked the culmination of these long anatomical experiments. Their vocal tracts were fully capable of producing the full range of vowels and consonants that define human language today. What had once been incremental adjustments in throat, skull, and chest had converged into a finely tuned system. The human voice was no longer just a signal. It was an instrument with the potential for infinite variation. Evidence for this refinement comes not only from anatomy, but also from the traces of culture. Sites like Jebel Arhoud in Morocco, dating to around 300,000 years ago, preserve the remains of early Homo sapiens, with skull shapes remarkably close to our own. The rounded craniums and flexed bases suggest the ability to create the resonance patterns needed for full speech. When paired with archaeological evidence of symbolic behavior, ochre markings, beadwork, and elaborate toolkits, the connection between anatomy and communication becomes clear. A body capable of speech was meeting a mind capable of symbolism. The descent of the larynx, though essential, carried risks. It made choking more likely, as food and air now shared a longer pathway. Evolution rarely grants without cost. That this trade-off persisted suggests the advantages of expanded vocal range outweighed the dangers. A voice capable of subtlety, persuasion, and coordination became more valuable to survival than the safety of a higher larynx. It was a gamble that shaped our species. We can think of this transformation as the creation of a new kind of landscape, not of earth and stone, but of sound. Into this acoustic landscape, humans could project identity, memory, and emotion. A longer tract allowed deeper tones. A reshaped skull base allowed clearer vowels. Stronger lungs allowed longer phrases. Each adjustment made the voice more versatile, and together they produced something that no other species could replicate. Comparisons with Neanderthals reveal just how close our evolutionary cousins came to sharing this gift. Their anatomy suggests they too possessed lowered larynges and resonant cavities capable of speech-like sounds. Reconstructions of their vocal tracts show the possibility of distinct vowels and consonants. If differences existed, they were subtle, not absolute. The line between Neanderthal and Sapien's voices may have been narrower than we once thought. This convergence underscores a deeper truth. The shaping of the vocal tract was not a sudden leap, but a gradual drift, carried by countless breaths across countless generations. Each hum, each cry, each shout left a faint imprint, nudging anatomy toward greater flexibility. By the time humans were fully modern in both form and capacity, their bodies carried an inheritance millions of years in the making. From that inheritance, the foundations of spoken language would rise. The vocal tract had become a finely tuned channel, capable of turning air into meaning. Every word spoken today, every song, every whisper rests upon that ancient shaping of bone and breath. The human voice had at last become the defining sound of our species. The human voice had become an instrument shaped by bone and breath. Yet, an instrument is only as powerful as the stage upon which it is played. Fire offered that stage. The real mystery is not only when flames were first mastered, but how they reshaped the possibilities of human sound once they glowed steadily in the dark. The earliest evidence for controlled fire is scattered and fragile, as much ash as certainty. At Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, archaeologists uncovered layers of burned bone and plant material dating close to 1 million years ago. These traces may mark one of the earliest hearths tended by human hands. Other sites, like Gesher Beno Yaakov in Israel, show clusters of charred flints and seeds nearly 800,000 years old. Science cannot say for sure whether these fires burned every night or only in rare moments, but the evidence suggests our ancestors were no longer mere opportunists. They were caretakers of flame. What did this mean for the voice? Fire changed the rhythm of human life. Night no longer ended in silence and fear. Instead, circles of light pulled groups together, illuminating faces, casting moving shadows on stone walls, and inviting sound into spaces where it could linger. The humble scientist must admit, we cannot hear those ancient gatherings, but analogies from modern hunter-gatherer societies help us imagine. In nearly every culture studied, firelight brings music, story, and play. Why should it have been otherwise for our distant ancestors? The flames themselves offered rhythm. The crackle of wood, the steady pulse of glowing embers, the sudden pop of resin created an acoustic environment that invited imitation. Children may have echoed these sounds with their voices, while adults added layers of hums, claps, or low chants. Laughter may have spread as the group experimented with the possibilities of sound, turning survival fires into rehearsal spaces for rhythm. These gatherings had consequences far beyond entertainment. Fire extended the hours of wakefulness. Extra time in the evening allowed for longer interactions, and those interactions likely shaped memory and communication. Repeated sounds could become patterns. Patterns could take root in collective memory. With every chant or rhythmic call, humans were practicing the art of linking sound to meaning. This was not yet language, but it was the scaffolding upon which language could be built. Archaeological traces, though silent, point to this transformation. Charcoal in caves, blackened ceilings, and clusters of burned bones all hint at repeated gatherings in the same places. Each hearth was a laboratory of sound, where breath became play, and play became rehearsal for symbolic thought. Around these flames, the human voice began to stretch itself into new shapes, discovering not just what could be said, but what could be shared. What began as playful imitation of sparks and crackles slowly grew into something deeper. Voices carried in the glow of fire began to follow patterns, and those patterns revealed a hidden capacity of the human mind. The haunting question is whether these early rhythms were simply entertainment, or whether they were the first stirrings of something we might call culture. Rhythm seems to belong to us as much as breath. Infants, before they know words, instinctively move to beats. Across the world today, even the most isolated communities shape sound into cycles of drumming, clapping, or chanting. If this tendency is so universal now, it is difficult to imagine it absent in the past. Around the fire, rhythm may have been discovered by accident, a hand tapping a log in time with the pop of burning wood, a chorus of hums rising and falling in unison, laughter swelling as others joined. The archaeological record cannot give us sound, but it can show us the settings where sound would have thrived. At Gesher Benot Yaakov in Israel, layers of charred seeds and burned flint dating to nearly 800,000 years ago reveal repeated use of fire at the same locations. This suggests that groups gathered regularly at shared hearths. While we cannot know what they did in those circles of light, the repeated return to the same places hints at traditions, and traditions are fertile ground for rhythm. Shared rhythm would not have been a luxury. It strengthened bonds, aligning more than voices. Modern studies show that when people chant or sing together, their heart rates and breathing often synchronize. If this can be measured today, it is reasonable to suspect it happened in deep time as well. Firelight chants may have synchronized not just bodies but intentions, transforming scattered individuals into groups with greater cohesion. This cohesion carried survival value. A group that trusted one another, that could coordinate more easily, was better prepared for hunts, for foraging, and for facing predators. Sound created through firelight may have been as vital as spears or shelters. The evidence is thin, but suggests that what began as playful imitation may have become a tool for survival, woven into the very rhythm of human life. Rhythm also served memory. Even without words, patterns of sound could carry meaning. A repeated sequence might signal the order of tasks in a hunt, or the steps of preparing food. Just as children today learn through rhyme before they master prose, early humans may have relied on sound patterns to transmit knowledge. Around the fire, the night became not just a time of safety, but a classroom where memory was trained through repetition. The glow of flame and the pulse of rhythm together gave the human voice a new role. It was no longer bound only to signal fear, claim territory, or soothe a child. It became a shared experiment, a rehearsal for meaning that went beyond the moment. If rhythm could train memory, then performance could awaken imagination. The fire did not only illuminate the night, it transformed it into a stage, where shadows moved across stone walls and voices merged with the crackle of burning wood. What remains is a quiet but persistent question. Were these performances the first steps towards symbolic thought? Imitation may have played a central role. A hunter, crouched by the fire, might grunt and stamp to mimic the chase of prey, while others echoed with cries that suggested pursuit. These were not words, but they were narratives told through movement and sound. Children watching such reenactments may have joined in, adding their own calls, learning not only the rhythm but the memory of the hunt itself. In this way, performance could preserve knowledge without language, carrying it forward through embodied play. The fire itself seemed to invite these experiments. Its glow was hypnotic, its sounds unpredictable yet patterned. Flames leapt and shadows shifted, creating an environment that encouraged the mind to make associations, to see shapes in flicker, and to hear rhythm in crackle. We cannot know exactly what ancient humans saw or imagined in the fire, but the archaeological record shows that symbolic practices began to emerge alongside repeated fire use pigments like ochre scraped and stored, stones arranged deliberately, bones treated in ways that suggest more than simple consumption. It may be coincidence, or it may be that the fire provided the sensory focus that allowed symbols to take root. Chanting would have deepened this process. When a group repeats sounds together, individuals dissolve into the collective. Breath, heartbeat, and voice align. Modern rituals show us how powerful this effect can be, binding communities through a sense of shared identity. It is not difficult to imagine that early chanting around fire produced the same effects, merging individuals into a single rhythm. Such moments may have been among the earliest experiences of being more than oneself, of belonging to something larger. From there, imagination needed little encouragement. Shadows became animals, voices became storms, a chant became a story, even if no words shaped its outline. The evidence is thin, but suggests that the cognitive leap towards symbol may have been rehearsed in these firelit gatherings long before it appeared in art or writing. The legacy of those nights still lingers. We continue to sing lullabies to children, using rhythm and tone to soothe before words can be understood. We gather around campfires and tell stories, finding comfort in the glow and cadence of voices. We dance and chant in unison, feeling our hearts synchronize. These behaviors are not inventions of civilization. They are inheritances shaped across hundreds of thousands of years of firelight experiments. Around the hearth, humans discovered that voices could do more than warn or soothe. They could create shared worlds, fragile but enduring, born of breath, flame, and imagination. Around the hearth, voices had begun to find rhythm, but sound was never the only thread of meaning. Bodies moved, hands pointed, and eyes held their own conversations in the glow of the flames. The haunting question is how much of early human communication still relied on gesture, even as voices grew more flexible. Modern research offers valuable clues. Studies of primates show that many of their most complex signals are not vocal but gestural. A chimpanzee can extend an arm to request grooming, raise a hand to halt a rival, or tilt its head to guide attention. These gestures are intentional, not reflexive, and they rely on shared understanding. If our closest relatives use their bodies in this way, it is reasonable to believe that early humans did as well, layering sound on top of a foundation already laid by movement. The evidence for ancient gesture is indirect, but it emerges in surprising places. The very structure of the human hand suggests a history of both tool use and expressive communication. Our thumbs are longer than those of other apes, our palms broader, and our fingers capable of delicate precision. These traits are often studied in the context of stone tools, but they also hint at a body built for pointing, beckoning, and shaping meaning through motion. Fossils from Homo heidelbergensis and Neanderthals show hands nearly indistinguishable from our own, capable not only of gripping spears, but of sculpting signals in the air. Archaeological reconstructions of early shelters and hearths also suggest arrangements where gesture would have been vital. Imagine a group seated in semicircle around fire. Sound could carry across, but subtle shifts of posture or glances could guide attention as powerfully as words. A hand raised to silence children, a finger pointing toward the darkness where eyes had caught movement, a nod of agreement shared between hunters. These moments leave no trace in the fossil record, but their absence in survival scenarios would be difficult to imagine. Facial expression added another layer. Long before words, humans possessed faces capable of extraordinary nuance. The lifting of brows, the narrowing of eyes, the slight curl of lips, all of these carried meaning. Neuroscience shows that humans process facial cues with remarkable speed, and this capacity likely stretches deep into prehistory. Even in silence, faces spoke. The balance between voice and gesture may have been uneven. Sounds could startle or carry far, but gestures allowed for subtlety. In hunting, where silence was survival, hand signs and eye contact may have done more than cries or calls. In conflict, posture and stance could display dominance or submission more effectively than volume. Gesture was not replaced by voice. It was its silent partner, ensuring that communication remained flexible and layered. The fire gave space for sound, but it also lit the body. In that glow, posture and expression still dominated meaning, binding groups together through a language of movement that needed no words. If the fire illuminated faces and bodies, then it also illuminated the interplay between gesture and sound. Neither existed in isolation. Together, they formed a system far richer than either alone. What remains is a difficult puzzle. Did the earliest layers of language emerge more from hands or from voices? Comparative studies of modern primates lean toward the hands. Apes often rely more on gestures than vocalizations when flexibility is required. Their calls may be fixed by instinct, but their gestures show creativity. A chimpanzee can invent a new motion to communicate with a specific partner, and experiments reveal that groups can establish shared meanings through repeated gestures. If our evolutionary cousins already show such adaptability, it is likely that early humans pushed this further, developing gestural repertoires that shifted with context. Fossil evidence adds weight to this picture. The structure of the shoulder and arm in Homo erectus and later species shows adaptations not only for throwing but also for controlled, expressive movement. Hands shaped stone tools with precision, but the same dexterity could easily have been turned to communication. Archaeologists cannot unearth a pointing finger, but they can note that the hand itself, preserved in bone, had the capability. What the bones cannot tell us, we can only infer from modern behavior. Today, pointing is one of the earliest gestures used by infants, appearing long before they master speech. It is a profoundly social act, one that assumes another's attention can be directed and shared. The universality of pointing across cultures suggests deep evolutionary roots. Early humans, seated in the flicker of firelight, likely pointed toward animals, tools, or distant movement. Each gesture was a spark of shared awareness, building common ground before words could supply detail. Facial expressions added subtlety. A smile could soften tension after a quarrel. A raised brow could convey skepticism. A grimace could warn of danger without a sound. Many of these expressions are cross-cultural and instinctive, which points to their antiquity. Even in silence, a group could sustain complex exchanges through expressions alone. Layered on top of these gestures came sound, but not in a way that erased their importance. A grunt paired with a pointing hand could sharpen meaning. A call combined with a posture of warning could magnify urgency. The integration of gesture and sound may have been the true birthplace of language, each reinforcing the other until they formed a system capable of carrying nuance and abstraction. It is tempting to think of early communication as a competition between hand and voice, yet the more plausible picture is collaboration. The hands shaped meaning in silence, while the voice extended it into distance. Together they created a flexible code, woven from movement and breath, that carried humans further than either could alone. Cooperation in daily survival would have made these silent signals indispensable. A group tracking prey across grasslands could not afford careless noise. A single raised arm might freeze movement. A flick of the wrist could direct attention. A crouched posture could warn of hidden danger. These gestures were not decorative, they were lifelines. The lingering question is not whether gestures existed, but how much of human achievement in this period depended upon them. Archaeological remains cannot capture a hand signal exchanged during a hunt. What they can show us, however, are the consequences of coordination. Sites marked by butchered elephants and scattered stone tools reveal that early humans worked in teams. The carving of meat from such massive animals would have demanded efficiency, with individuals moving into position and sharing tasks. We cannot hear the voices of that cooperation, but it is difficult to imagine such scenes unfolding without a parallel web of gestures guiding action. Gestures also carried emotion and trust. A hand resting on the shoulder of an ally, a nod signaling reassurance, or an embrace after danger passed. These were ways of maintaining bonds when words were absent. Emotional expression through movement is deeply rooted in us. Modern neuroscience shows how powerfully body language shapes perception. If this is true today, it likely held true in the deep past. Early humans may not have had words for loyalty, comfort, or forgiveness, yet they lived those ideas through gestures. In ritual settings, movement may have preceded structured sound. Dances, rhythmic postures, or repeated gestures performed around firelight could bind groups together long before language gave such rituals narrative form. Shadows amplified motion. turning even small movements into larger performances. When chants and sounds eventually merged with these physical rhythms, a new dimension of shared meaning unfolded. Even as speech slowly expanded, gestures did not fade. They continued as partners, grounding abstract words in visible form. Today, when we point, raise our hands, or let our expressions echo our voices, we are carrying forward this ancient legacy. Scientific studies confirm that gesture and speech are intertwined in the brain, suggesting that they co-evolved as parts of the same communicative system. Without the scaffolding provided by gesture, spoken language might not have developed with the richness it did. The story of gesture reminds us that language was never only about the voice. Meaning lived in posture, in the tilt of the head, in the sweep of an arm. Sound gave distance, but gesture gave clarity. What we cannot know for certain is the precise balance between the two in those early days. Yet it seems likely that even as voices grew louder, the body continued to speak, ensuring that communication was layered, resilient, and deeply human. The body continued to speak, even as voices grew stronger, yet the question of how far those voices had carried before language remains one of the deepest mysteries. To search for answers, archaeologists often turn to places where time has kept its silence, preserving not words but bones. Among the most haunting of these places is Cima de los Huesos, the pit of bones in northern Spain. What can these remains tell us about the sounds made by our ancestors hundreds of thousands of years ago? Cima de los Huesos lies in the Atapuerca Mountains, in a cave system whose passages twist and narrow before dropping into a chamber 30 feet deep. Within that chamber, more than 7,000 human fossils have been recovered, representing at least 28 individuals who lived around 430,000 years ago. The people of Cima are often seen as ancestors of Neanderthals, standing at a point in our lineage where voices had already begun to stretch into ranges beyond those of earlier species. The evidence comes not from preserved sounds, but from the shape of bone. The skulls of Cima de los Huesos show features associated with strong vocal capacity, large brain cases, flexed cranial bases, and inner ear structures tuned to frequencies similar to modern humans. These traits suggest that their ears were sensitive to the same range of sounds we use in speech, and their throats were capable of producing them. While we cannot say they had language as we know it, the physical tools for complex vocalization were in place. The mystery deepens when we consider what these people might have done with those voices. Fossils alone cannot reveal conversations, but they can hint at behavior. Among the remains in the pit, one skull bears evidence of deliberate blows to the head, interpreted by some as signs of interpersonal violence. Others see the accumulation of bodies in the chamber as intentional deposition, perhaps an early form of ritual. If bodies were placed deliberately in the pit, it implies symbolic thinking, and if symbolic thought was present, then sound may also have been shaped into more than calls or cries. The presence of deliberate burials, however disputed, raises the question of whether sound had already taken on a symbolic role. Could chants, laments, or rhythmic cries have accompanied the placing of bodies? We cannot know for certain, but modern human rituals strongly suggest the possibility. Around the world, death and sound are intertwined wails, hymns, and chants, marking the passage between life and memory. If these patterns are nearly universal today, their roots may extend deep into the past, echoing faintly in the silence of Cima de los Huesos. The pit holds only bones, yet bones carry echoes. The angles of skulls, the hollows of inner ears, the proportions of throats they whisper of voices, never recorded but once alive, reverberating in chambers of stone. Those echoes grow louder when we compare the bones from Cima with the anatomy of modern humans. The inner ear structures, preserved with remarkable clarity, suggest sensitivity to sounds in the 2 to 4 kHz range. This is the same range where much of human speech resides, especially vowel sounds. If their ears were tuned like ours, then it would follow that their throats and mouths had evolved to produce similar patterns. But what kinds of sounds were those, and how close were they to words? Neanderthal fossils, which descended from populations like those at Cima, offer additional clues. Hyoid bones recovered from later sites, such as Kibara Cave in Israel, show striking similarity to our own. The hyoid anchors muscles of the tongue and larynx, and its presence in Neanderthals suggests the mechanical foundation for articulate speech. Since the people of Sema stood earlier in this lineage, it is reasonable to infer that they too carried much of this potential, even if their vocal systems were still in transition. The challenge lies not in anatomy, but in behavior. Physical potential does not guarantee cultural expression. It is possible that the people of Sema had voices capable of rich sound, yet used them only in limited ways, for calls, warnings, and emotional cries. The bones cannot tell us whether those voices carried names, stories, or chants. Yet when we step back and consider the context of their world, silence seems unlikely. 430,000 years ago, Europe was a patchwork of forests, rivers, and valleys shaped by shifting ice ages. Groups needed to coordinate hunts, share shelter, and protect young. Gestures alone could not have carried across dense woodlands or over ridges. Sound was necessary. Calls might rally hunters or alert others to danger. Repeated patterns might reinforce memory, just as rhythm does for us today. The survival of these communities depended on cooperation, and cooperation thrives on communication. The accumulation of bodies in the pit also challenges us to think beyond survival. Some argue that the remains washed in naturally, others that they were deliberately placed. If the latter is true, then sound may have played a role in ceremony. Ritual requires performance. Performance requires expression. Even if words were absent, symbolic sounds, moans, chants, or patterned cries could have marked the act. The evidence is thin, but suggests a merging of biology and culture. The voices of Sema may have been used not only to warn or to guide, but also to mourn. In this way, the bones point toward a threshold. They do not prove the existence of language, but they show that the physical and cognitive groundwork for it was in place. The people of Sema lived at a time when the human voice was evolving from a tool of survival into an instrument of meaning. Their bones are silent, but the silence itself asks us to imagine what those first symbolic sounds might have been. The threshold marked by Sema de los Huesos is perhaps most powerful in what it suggests about continuity. These individuals did not live in isolation. They stood within an unfolding lineage that would give rise to Neanderthals, and their anatomy already leaned toward what we recognize in ourselves. If their ears could hear the range of speech, and their throats could produce it, then the question becomes, how much of language's music was already stirring in their gatherings? Later, Neanderthal sites help us extend the story. At El Sidron in Spain, genetic evidence points to shared FOXP2 genes, a mutation associated in modern humans with speech and language. At sites like La Chapelle aux Saints, burial practices hint at ritual, suggesting voices lifted in ceremony. These echoes align with the anatomy glimpsed at Sema, drawing a line of continuity through time. If Neanderthals could chant, sing, or speak in ways resembling us, then the people of Sema may have carried the earliest forms of that capacity. What remains uncertain is the form those sounds took. Were they proto-words, short vocal signals tied to objects or actions? Were they melodic chants, repetitive and rhythmic, designed to bind groups together? Or were they cries shaped less by meaning and more by emotion, closer to music than to language? Archaeology cannot give us the answer. But the sheer number of individuals preserved at Sema suggests a social world where communication was central. 28 lives intertwined would have needed voices to coordinate, to comfort, and perhaps to remember. The pit itself offers another layer of mystery. Why were so many bodies placed in such an inaccessible chamber? If it was intentional, then it required planning, cooperation, and symbolic framing. Such an act rarely passes in silence. It is difficult to imagine bodies lowered one after another without sound accompanying the gesture. Even if we cannot recover the words or whether there were words at all, it seems plausible that symbolic cries, laments, or chants marked the act. The echoes of Sema de los Huesos remind us that language was not born in an instant. It grew in layers, shaped by anatomy, by survival, and by culture. In the bones of these early humans we glimpse a moment when sound was more than survival, when the voice may have begun to carry the weight of symbol. What we cannot know for certain is the content of those symbols. What the bones show us is the possibility, a whisper of voices poised at the edge of language. Cima de los huesos is silent now, a chamber of fossils resting in the dark. Yet within that silence lies the resonance of potential, the possibility that long before words were spoken, the human voice was already practicing the art of meaning. The echoes from Cima de los Huesos hint at bodies already shaped for sound. But to understand how those sounds sharpened into tools of language, we must look deeper than bone. Within the twists of DNA lie changes that reshaped the human voice from potential into precision. How could a single genetic shift alter the destiny of communication so profoundly? One of the most studied clues is the FOXP2 gene. This gene regulates networks in the brain connected to motor control, including the delicate coordination of lips, tongue, and larynx required for speech. In modern humans, mutations in FOXP2 can cause severe difficulties with articulation and grammar, showing how central it is to our ability to speak. When scientists compared ancient DNA from Neanderthals with our own, they discovered that both carried a derived version of FOXP2, distinct from the form found in chimpanzees. This shared version likely arose around 200,000 years ago, a period that aligns with the emergence of anatomically modern humans in Africa. The implications are striking. If both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens carried this genetic change, then both lineages may have shared a capacity for speech-like communication. The mutation did not create language by itself, but it fine-tuned the neurological pathways needed for precise vocal control. What the bones could not reveal, the genes now whisper, that the architecture of our voices was not a gift to one species alone. The story of FOXP2 reminds us how recent and fragile our linguistic capacities are. 200,000 years is a brief span in evolutionary time. Before this point, hominins may have had voices capable of varied sound, but lacked the neurological precision to chain those sounds into structured systems. The mutation acted like a subtle adjustment to an instrument, aligning the strings so that complex music could be played. Yet the mystery remains. How exactly did this genetic change shape behavior? Ancient DNA cannot preserve conversations, only sequences of nucleotides. We can infer that FOXP2 improved fine motor control, but we cannot know whether it immediately produced new forms of vocal culture. Perhaps the mutation spread slowly, its effects building over generations. Perhaps it was only when paired with symbolic thought, already taking root in gestures and rituals, that its full potential was unlocked. What the evidence does suggest is that around this time, both in Africa and across Neanderthal territories, communication began to deepen. Archaeological layers reveal more sophisticated tools, deliberate use of pigments, and hints of ritual. These cultural markers, though debated, may signal that sound itself was being woven into new symbolic webs. FOXP2 did not act alone, but it provided the neurological thread that allowed those webs to hold. The gene story is not one of sudden transformation, but of potential realized. A subtle change in DNA, repeated through generations, gave the human voice the control it needed to move from cries and chants toward the architecture of language. If FOXP2 provided the neurological thread for complex vocal control, then it also bound together species once thought to be divided by silence. The discovery that Neanderthals carried the same derived version as modern humans forces us to reconsider the boundary between them. Could their voices have been closer to ours than we once imagined? For decades, Neanderthals were portrayed as mute, grunting figures, capable of strength, but not of subtlety. This view rested on assumptions about their anatomy and intelligence, shaped more by prejudice than by evidence. The recovery of their DNA shifted that story. With FOXP2 present in their genome, and skeletal evidence such as the Kibara hyoid bone showing a laryngeal structure similar to ours, it becomes increasingly difficult to argue that they lacked the capacity for speech. The real question is not whether Neanderthals could speak, but how they used their voices. Archaeological evidence paints a picture of cultural depth. Pigment use at sites like Cueva de los Aviones in Spain, personal ornaments made from shells, and possible burials with symbolic meaning. These behaviors suggest a mind capable of abstraction, and if abstraction was present, then vocal expression likely followed. Whether their speech mirrored ours in grammar and complexity remains uncertain, but the overlap in biology and culture suggests that their voices carried meaning beyond simple calls. FOX2 is not a language gene in the narrow sense. It influences networks that extend across the brain, linking motor control with learning, memory, and even social behavior. In modern humans, it interacts with pathways that govern procedural learning, the ability to master sequences, whether in movement or in sound. This raises the possibility that the mutation not only refined the mechanics of speech, but also enhanced the ability to learn vocal patterns. If so, then Neanderthals and Homo sapiens may have shared a talent for imitating, repeating, and stabilizing sounds into systems recognizable as language. Still, the limits of evidence must be acknowledged. Ancient DNA can reveal sequences, but it cannot reveal tone, accent, or vocabulary. A Neanderthal voice may have sounded deeper, perhaps more resonant, shaped by different chest proportions and cranial anatomy. The range of vowels they could produce might have been slightly narrower, as some reconstructions suggest. These details remain open questions, shadows cast by bones and genes. Yet what is clear is that they did not live in silence. This realization collapses a long-held divide. The ability to shape sound into meaning was not the unique property of one lineage, but a shared inheritance. FOXP2 was part of a bridge, linking species through the circuitry of the brain and the breath of the voice. The more we learn, the harder it becomes to define where human language truly began, or with whom. The bridge that FOXP2 created was not only biological but cultural. Once fine motor control of the voice was possible, the potential for patterned sound expanded dramatically. The question that lingers is not whether the mutation enabled speech, but how communities wove this capacity into the fabric of their daily lives. Around 200,000 years ago, archaeological records begin to show subtle yet telling shifts. In Africa, sites such as Blombos Cave, though dating later, around 75,000 years ago, preserve ochre carvings and shell beads that hint at symbolic thought. In Europe, Neanderthal sites hold evidence of pigment use and personal adornment. While these artifacts appear tens of thousands of years after the FOXP2 mutation arose, they suggest a long gestation period in which neurological potential slowly translated into cultural expression. It may have taken generations for the brain's new wiring to manifest fully in behavior. FOXP2's impact was not limited to producing clear sounds. It likely supported the learning of sequences, the retention of patterns, and the transmission of knowledge across time. This capacity would have been invaluable for oral tradition, allowing groups to stabilize chants, hunting calls, or proto-words so they could be remembered and repeated. What began as cries in Firelight could be preserved across generations, no longer lost to the wind but carried in memory. This change was transformative because it created the possibility of cumulative culture. Without precise vocal imitation, each generation would start anew, inventing calls and patterns without continuity. With improved control, however, sounds could be stabilized, shared, and built upon. The mutation may therefore have marked the moment when communication stopped being ephemeral and started becoming history. We must be cautious not to overstate the role of one gene. FOXP2 was not a switch that turned language on overnight. It was one strand in a complex weave that included brain expansion, social cooperation, and cultural experimentation. Yet its presence in both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens highlights how crucial it was. Without it, the fine-grained articulation needed for structured language might never have taken hold. The echoes of this ancient shift remain in us today. Every sentence spoken, every song sung, every whispered story rests on neural circuits tuned by this genetic change. In our ability to repeat sounds with accuracy, to chain syllables into words, and to pass them across generations, we carry the inheritance of FOXP2. The bones at Cima de los Huesos showed us bodies prepared for sound. The mutation of FOXP2 shows us minds prepared to shape it. Together, they illuminate a turning point where the voice was no longer just a tool of survival, but a vessel of memory, imagination, and culture. The genetic bridge of FOXP2 showed that Neanderthals and humans shared a capacity for precise vocal control, but the question remains unresolved in its most evocative form. If Neanderthals spoke, what did their voices actually sound like? Reconstructions begin with anatomy. Neanderthal skulls, preserved in caves across Europe and Western Asia, offer detailed clues. Their vocal tracts were not identical to ours, but similar enough to suggest comparable sound ranges. The discovery of a Neanderthal hyoid bone at Kibara Cave in Israel revealed a structure nearly indistinguishable from that of modern humans. The hyoid is small yet critical. It anchors the muscles that coordinate tongue and larynx, and without it, complex speech is impossible. Its presence in Neanderthals strongly implies that their throats were tuned for articulate sound, but anatomy alone cannot give us tone or resonance. To imagine their voices, scientists use models of breath and sound passing through reconstructed tracts. These simulations suggest that Neanderthals could produce clear vowel contrasts, the backbone of language. However, subtle differences in skull and chest proportions may have lowered the pitch of their voices. Deep, resonant, perhaps slower in rhythm than ours, their speech would have carried a quality distinct yet familiar. We cannot know whether they spoke in words arranged like ours, but the physical evidence suggests a voice capable of symbolic expression. This possibility is strengthened by the cultural record. Neanderthals made pigments, shaped ornaments from shells and bones, and in some cases appear to have buried their dead with care. Such acts almost certainly required shared meaning. If meaning existed, then sound likely carried it. A chant over a body, a cry to mark a hunt, or a series of calls passed from parent to child, these are plausible scenarios, supported not by recordings, but by analogy with the universality of such practices in human societies. Skeptics argue that symbolic behavior in Neanderthals was limited, and perhaps sporadic. Some pigment traces may have practical rather than ritual explanations. Some burials may not have been intentional, yet the weight of evidence grows as more discoveries emerge. At Cueva de los Aviones in Spain, Neanderthals used marine shells mixed with pigments, a behavior difficult to explain without symbolic intent. To engage in such activity without vocal reinforcement, without sounds that marked and shared meaning, seems unlikely. The Neanderthal voice, then, emerges in the dark not as a certainty, but as an echo. Deep, resonant, tuned for vowels, capable of carrying symbols across firelit gatherings. We cannot replay it, but bones, genes, and artifacts together whisper that their voices were not so different from our own. To glimpse how Neanderthals may have used their voices, we must step into the contexts of their lives. What kinds of settings demanded sound, and how might those sounds have been shaped into meaning? Hunting provides the clearest example. Neanderthals lived in Ice Age landscapes where cooperation was essential for survival. Fossil evidence shows that they hunted large game, such as bison, horses, and even mammoths. Coordinating such hunts without complex communication seems improbable. A low call may have signaled movement. A sharp cry might have triggered an ambush. Repetition could have reinforced group rhythm during the chase. These sounds need not have been words in the modern sense, but they carried information structured enough to direct action. Rituals, though harder to confirm, suggest another layer of vocal expression. At La Chapelle-aux-Sens in France, a Neanderthal skeleton appears to have been intentionally buried, with the body placed carefully in a shallow grave. If this interpretation is correct, it points to symbolic practice. In nearly every human culture studied, death and ritual are accompanied by sound wails, laments, chants. To imagine silence at such a moment seems less likely than to imagine voices rising in collective expression. The evidence is thin, but it opens a window to a world where the Neanderthal voice may have carried the weight of mourning and memory. Daily life also required constant communication. Archaeological sites reveal hearths where groups gathered, tool workshops where stone flakes accumulated, and shelters built from wood and bone. These places were not quiet. Children needed soothing. Lessons in toolmaking required demonstration and perhaps vocal reinforcement. Subtle vocalizations, grunts, hums, proto-words could have guided apprentices as they shaped stone. These teaching moments may have been some of the earliest instances of sound stabilizing skill across generations. Even in the absence of direct evidence, parallels with modern hunter-gatherer groups provide insights. Among them, voice is rarely confined to words alone. It blends with gesture, song, and rhythm. A call may double as instruction and encouragement. A chant may serve as memory and entertainment. Neanderthal societies, with their shared genetics and overlapping capacities, likely experienced a similar blend. The voice was not a separate tool but part of a larger system of sound, body, and symbol. What we cannot recover is the exact texture of their speech. Reconstructions suggest lower pitch, perhaps slower cadence, shaped by broader rib cages and slightly different cranial proportions. Their voices may have carried a depth we no longer possess, resonant in caves and across valleys. If we could hear them now, we might recognize their intent, even if their words escaped us. The evidence is incomplete, but the pattern grows clearer. Neanderthals did not live in silence. Their voices threaded through hunts, rituals, and daily life, shaping bonds of survival and meaning. If Neanderthal voices carried through hunts and rituals, then they must also have carried through the intimacy of daily bonds. One of the most persistent questions is what those voices sounded like in moments of tenderness. Did parents hum to restless children? Did partners soothe one another with soft tones in the glow of firelight? We cannot know with certainty, yet the universality of such behaviors in our own species makes the possibility difficult to dismiss. Archaeological evidence hints at the care Neanderthals showed one another. Fossils reveal individuals who lived for years despite severe injuries, their survival made possible by group support. In such settings, voices would have played a role in comfort and reassurance. A gentle sound, even if not a word, can reduce fear and foster trust. If Neanderthals practiced such care, as their skeletons suggest, then their voices likely carried not only command and ritual, but also affection. This breadth of vocal use suggests that Neanderthal voices were instruments of identity. Every group had its rhythms, its repeated calls, its shared vocal patterns. Over time, these could have distinguished one community from another, just as dialects and accents do today. The evidence cannot confirm this, but it would fit with what we know about social groups maintaining cohesion through shared signals. The valleys and caves of Ice Age Europe may have echoed with variations of sound that marked belonging. Modern reconstructions reinforce this vision. Using models of the vocal tract, researchers suggest that Neanderthals had the ability to produce the full range of vowels and many consonants, though perhaps with slight limitations compared to modern humans. The likely result was a voice deeper and more resonant, but still capable of carrying symbolic meaning. If we could stand in their presence, their speech might sound unfamiliar, yet recognizably human, bridging the gap between species through the common fabric of voice. Their legacy remains in us. Genetic studies reveal that many people today carry fragments of Neanderthal DNA. These fragments influence traits as diverse as immunity and skin tone, but they also whisper of deeper connections. If Neanderthals and Homo sapiens interbred, as the evidence shows, then our voices too may carry echoes of theirs. Every word spoken today may contain faint traces of sounds once shaped in Neanderthal throats. The story of Neanderthal voices challenges the image of them as silent or primitive. Instead, it suggests a world alive, with sound resonant, symbolic, woven into survival and ritual alike. What they said, we cannot recover, but the fact that they said it, in tones deep and carrying, seems ever more likely. In this recognition lies a quiet kinship. Their voices may have fallen silent, but the possibility that they once spoke as we do binds their story into our own. The possibility that Neanderthals spoke in resonant tones reminds us that the story of language was not confined to one lineage. Yet in Africa, among the early populations of Homo sapiens, another step was beginning to unfold. The central question we face is how the raw material of cries and chants transformed into the first stable sounds we might recognize as names. Fossil and archaeological evidence places the emergence of anatomically modern humans in Africa around 300,000 years ago. These early sapiens inherited the vocal capacities shaped by generations before them, but their cultural landscapes opened new possibilities. They lived in groups whose survival depended not only on cooperation, but also on the ability to pass knowledge with precision. It is within this context that sound began to move beyond fleeting signals into proto-words, repeated vocal forms tethered to objects or actions. We cannot know the exact syllables spoken. Yet the logic of survival suggests what some of those early sounds might have meant. A consistent vocalization for water, repeated and shared, would have been invaluable when guiding others to a source. A stable sound for fire might have allowed warnings or instructions to travel quickly across a group. A repeated cry for a specific animal could aid in hunts, focusing attention on prey. These were not words in the grammatical sense, but foundations for naming. Archaeological sites like Pinnacle Point and Blombos Cave in South Africa provide glimpses into the symbolic worlds of these early sapiens. At Blombos, ochre engraved with geometric designs and shell beads stained with pigment suggest minds capable of abstraction. If they carved symbols into stone and shells, it is reasonable to think they also carved meaning into sound. The evidence is indirect, but the alignment of symbolic artifacts and vocal potential strengthens the case. Cognitive studies also offer clues. Modern infants begin by babbling, producing streams of sound before stabilizing them into words. Researchers note that repetition plays a central role in this process. Just as a child repeats mama until it becomes recognized as a label, so too may early sapiens have repeated sounds until their association with an object or action solidified within the group. Proto-words could have spread through habit and reinforcement, slowly weaving a shared vocabulary into daily life. The shift from cry to proto-word marks a profound threshold. For the first time, sound was not only a reaction, but a chosen marker, a tool for pointing without the hand, for naming without gesture. It was a step toward a world where memory, instruction, and identity could be stored not only in faces and movement, but in the air itself. Once sounds began to stabilize into proto-words, they transformed how groups of Homo sapiens coordinated their lives. A gesture could point, but a sound carried further, cutting across distance and darkness. The difficult question is how far this new capacity expanded the horizons of cooperation. Hunting illustrates the change. Before proto-words, coordination relied on posture, movement, and cries. With stable sounds, hunters could add vocal signals tied to specific roles. A repeated call might mean circle left, while another could mean wait. These calls were still rough, unshaped by grammar, but their consistency allowed information to pass more reliably. Archaeological sites where sapiens hunted large animals together suggest that such coordination was crucial. The kill sites at Clayses River in South Africa, where remains of antelope and seals were processed, point to strategies that required timing and cooperation. Proto-words may have been the invisible threads stitching these strategies together. Foraging carried similar demands. A sound associated with a particular fruit or root could direct others to food sources without elaborate pantomime. Stable vocal markers allowed information to spread quickly, perhaps even across groups. What once had to be shown could now be said. This capacity gave sapiens a flexibility their ancestors may have lacked. Memory, too, was reshaped. Proto-words gave groups a way to attach names to places, tools, and tasks. A repeated sound for a waterhole could carry across generations, guiding groups back season after season. A call for a specific tool type could help in teaching apprentices how to shape stone. These small steps toward naming supported the growth of cumulative culture, where knowledge was preserved rather than reinvented. The archaeological record at Blombos Cave provides a suggestive parallel. Beads and ochre fragments reveal symbolic thought, while engraved patterns hint at the storing of meaning outside the body. Proto-words may have been the auditory counterpart of these symbols, carrying abstraction into sound. We cannot draw a direct line, but the coincidence of symbolic artifacts and the rise of sapiens strengthens the case for naming as a cultural turning point. Comparisons with modern language origins research also shed light. Studies of how young children acquire speech show that stable words emerge from repeated associations, reinforced by caregivers. The process is slow at first, but once a threshold is crossed, vocabulary expands rapidly. Early sapiens groups may have experienced a similar tipping point. Once proto-words began to take hold, they likely multiplied, creating miniature lexicons of sounds tied to the most important elements of survival. Each proto-word was more than a sound. It was a fragment of shared understanding, carried in air, anchored in memory, and passed from mouth to ear. Together, they began to form the scaffolding upon which the vast architecture of language would rise. As proto-words multiplied, their influence extended beyond survival tasks into the shaping of identity itself. A sound could bind a group together, marking who belonged and who did not. The central puzzle we face is how these fragile beginnings of vocabulary became the roots of culture. Naming places may have been one of the first steps. Distinct sounds tied to rivers, caves, or hunting grounds allowed groups to orient themselves in landscapes stretching for hundreds of kilometers. This ability turned geography into memory, making it possible to pass knowledge of territory across generations. Proto-words transformed the world into a map drawn not on stone but in sound. Objects, too, gained names. Tools were central to sapiens' life, and teaching tool-making required more than demonstration. A repeated vocal marker for a flake, a core, or a finished blade could have guided apprentices as they practiced. This would have allowed techniques to spread more consistently, reinforcing the process of cultural transmission. Archaeological sites reveal remarkable continuity in stone tool traditions, suggesting that information traveled across generations with surprising stability. Proto-words may have been part of this invisible transmission system. Even social relationships could have been shaped by early naming. Stable sounds used as personal markers, rudimentary names may have helped groups distinguish individuals. Anthropologists studying small-scale societies today note that names play a central role in kinship and identity. If this pattern stretches back to early sapiens, then proto-words may have first carried not only objects and places, but also people. These early steps also nudged the human voice towards storytelling. A series of proto-words, combined with gesture and expression, could create simple narratives. A reenactment of a hunt might include vocal markers for animal, tool, and place, strung together with movement. Such performances may have been among the first spoken stories, limited in vocabulary but rich in shared meaning. Around the fire, proto-words could echo in chorus, reinforcing memory while stirring imagination. The leap from cry to proto-word may seem small, but its consequences were immense. It shifted communication from immediate signals to shared systems of reference. For the first time, sounds became labels, and labels became building blocks for culture. Archaeological traces engraved ochre, beads, coordinated hunts suggest minds already comfortable with symbol. Proto-words were the auditory expression of that same symbolic leap, fragile yet foundational. Though we cannot reconstruct the exact syllables, the evidence suggests that these first proto-words reshaped how sapiens lived, taught, and remembered. They carried survival, identity, and imagination in equal measure. From these fragile beginnings, the path toward language stretched forward, built on the breath of names spoken into the African air. The first proto-words carried names through the air, but sound was not the only medium of meaning. Humans also began to carve symbols into matter, staining stone, stringing beads, and colouring the bodies of the living and the dead. Why did our ancestors start pairing sounds with pigments and ornaments, creating a world where voice and object both carried meaning? Ochre provides one of the earliest and clearest windows into this shift. Across Africa, fragments of iron-rich stone have been uncovered in archaeological layers dating back hundreds of thousands of years. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, pieces of ochre engraved with cross-hatched lines have been dated to around 75,000 years ago. These are not random scratches. Their geometric regularity suggests intention and perhaps even symbolism. We cannot know what the marks meant, but they show that minds were beginning to place ideas into durable form. Pigment was not confined to stone. At pinnacle point, ochre was ground and possibly mixed for application to bodies or objects. If so, colour became a way of shaping identity, turning skin into canvas. The use of red ochre, in particular, may have symbolized vitality or blood, associations echoed across later cultures. Archaeologists debate whether these meanings were consistent or varied, but the persistence of ochre use across regions suggests it carried significance far beyond utility. Beads deepened this symbolic fabric. At Blombos, perforated shells stained with pigment were likely strung into necklaces or ornaments. Such objects transformed identity into something visible, a signal worn on the body. The presence of beads implies not only self-expression, but also recognition by others. Meaning was no longer only spoken or gestured. It could be seen, carried, and passed from one person to another in material form. Burials provide the most haunting clues. At Kafse Cave in Israel, a child was buried with red ochre and antlers, arranged with care. Much later, at Sungir in Russia, children were interred with thousands of beads. These acts suggest ritual, a deliberate framing of death within symbolic order. If bodies were painted, adorned, or placed with objects, it is difficult to imagine that silence surrounded the act. Ritual almost always joins matter with sound. A body coloured in ochre may also have been honoured with chants. Beads laid on the chest may have been accompanied by spoken names. The parallel is striking. As Proto-Words stabilized meaning in the air, ochre and beads stabilized meaning in matter. Together they formed a double stream of symbolism, sound, and object, each reinforcing the other. This convergence marks one of the most profound thresholds in human history, where culture no longer relied only on memory, but began to root itself in both breath and stone. If ochre marked bodies and beads adorned the living, then the question becomes, what role did these objects play in shaping community and ritual? Beads and pigments were not practical tools. They did not cut, scrape, or shelter. Their purpose was symbolic, and symbolism thrives in social life. A necklace of shells stained with ochre may have been a marker of belonging, a way to show kinship within a group or distinction from others. Archaeologists at Blombos Cave uncovered strings of such beads, suggesting they were worn, seen, and recognized. In this way, material symbols worked much like proto-words. They stabilized, meaning carried identity, and invited recognition. Burials strengthen this picture. At Kafse Cave, ochre was scattered on bones. At Sungir, thousands of ivory beads were placed with children, each bead requiring careful crafting and patient labour. These were not acts of survival. They were investments in meaning. To devote such effort to the dead implies beliefs that reached beyond immediate life. If sound was used alongside these objects as chants, laments, or names, the combination of voice and matter would have deepened the symbolic act. Ritual is rarely confined to one medium. It draws together sound, sight, and touch into unified performance. The persistence of ochre across regions and time is especially telling. From Africa to Europe, groups returned again and again to the same red pigment. Why red? We cannot know with certainty, but the colour's association with blood, vitality, and transformation seems a likely explanation. By applying ochre to skin or corpse, early humans may have been signalling life, death, or passage between the two. If proto-words carried the beginnings of naming, ochre carried the beginnings of symbolism made visible. These practices also hint at the rise of shared memory. Material symbols preserve meaning outside the body, allowing groups to stabilize ideas beyond immediate experience. A bead worn daily becomes a reminder of belonging. Ochre marks on stone become reminders of ritual. These objects would have carried meaning even in silence, but paired with proto-words or chants, they could have extended memory further still. What is striking is the parallel growth of symbolic objects and symbolic sounds. Both require repetition, both require recognition, and both bind individuals into groups. The archaeological record preserves beads and ochre, but the air above those objects must once have been filled with sound. A burial with pigment likely carried a chant. A decorated body likely carried a name. The silence of the record hides this dimension, yet the logic of ritual points us back to it. Through beads, ochre, and burials, Homo sapiens expanded meaning into new realms. The human voice no longer worked alone. It was joined by colour and ornament, by ritual and object, in weaving the earliest fabric of culture. If ochre and beads carried meaning in silence, then the question is how these symbols worked together with sound to create traditions that endured. Ritual is one of the clearest contexts where matter and voice converge. A burial marked with red pigment would not only be visual, but also auditory. Chants, laments, or repeated proto-words may have echoed in the air while ochre stained the skin or bones. Archaeology preserves the pigment, not the sound, yet it is difficult to imagine one without the other. Across human cultures, ritual almost always involves both voice and object, joining them into performances that renew memory. This convergence shaped identity. A bead necklace alone marked belonging, but when paired with a spoken name or chant, it deepened the sense of group cohesion. Proto-words for objects or places could align with beads and pigments, weaving meaning into both air and matter. In this way, identity became portable. It could be worn, seen, heard, and remembered. The archaeological record suggests that these practices were not isolated. At Blombos Cave, engraved ochre and beads appear together, implying an integrated symbolic system. At Kafsa, ochre accompanied burials. At Sungir, beads were massed in such numbers that they speak of ritual significance beyond the individual. Each site reveals a layering of sound and symbol, though only half the record, the material remains for us to study. The importance of this layering lies in its durability. Sounds alone vanish into air. Objects alone may puzzle without context. Together, they reinforce each other, carrying meaning across time. A chant tied to ochre becomes easier to remember. A bead tied to a name becomes more than ornament. In these combinations, we glimpse the beginnings of tradition. Practices repeated not just once, but across generations. Tradition opened the door to storytelling. Around the fire, decorated bodies and ornaments may have been accompanied by vocal performances that explained their significance. Even if proto-words were few, gestures, chants, and repeated sounds could create simple narratives. These narratives may have explained why ochre was used, why beads were worn, or why burials were performed. By joining sound with symbol, humans created stories that anchored culture. This blending of ochre and air marks one of the most important thresholds in prehistory. It shows that meaning was no longer fleeting, no longer confined to momentary cries or gestures. It had begun to stabilize, to embed itself in both voice and matter. Culture was becoming a shared inheritance, carried not only by memory, but by pigments, beads, and rituals that echoed with sound. Through this convergence, humanity stepped further into a symbolic world, where the invisible weight of meaning could be spoken, seen, and carried across generations. The weaving of sound with ochre and beads showed that meaning could be carried both in air and in matter, but sound itself was about to take another step. In the glow of Ice Age fires, groups of Homo sapiens began to stabilize not just proto-words but small sets of shared vocabulary that echoed across nights. How did scattered sounds crystallize into the first miniature lexicons, recognizable as the ancestors of language? Archaeological evidence from Africa during the Upper Paleolithic offers glimpses of increasingly complex symbolic life. At sites like Blombos and Apollo 11 Cave, ochre, ornaments, and engraved stones point to minds comfortable with abstraction. If such artifacts reflect symbolic thought, then it is likely that sound carried parallel symbolic weight. A proto-word for water or fire may have become so consistent that it was used by all members of a band, night after night, until it became the group's common reference. The context of Firelight played an essential role. In the darkened landscape of Ice Age Africa, fire created a circle of light where groups gathered, safe from predators, their faces illuminated, and their voices resonant. These were not fleeting encounters. Hours spent around the flames allowed repetition and rehearsal. A child could hear the same vocal label for water or food spoken by many mouths, reinforcing memory until the sound became fixed. Over time, these repeated associations hardened into stable miniature lexicons, vocabularies, small but shared. What words might have filled these first lexicons? We cannot recover them, yet survival suggests likely candidates. Names for essential elements, water, fire, shelter, tool, would have been invaluable. Labels for animals, both prey and predator, could sharpen coordination during hunts or warnings. Words for kin, perhaps short sounds tied to mother, father, or child, may have been among the earliest, reflecting the centrality of family in survival. These were not sentences, but they were beginnings of shared speech. Cognitive parallels appear in modern development. Infants babble and then stabilize small vocabularies of simple words, often centered on food, objects, or caregivers. These first words are repeated endlessly, shared across the family, until they form the foundation of communication. Early sapiens groups may have passed through a similar stage. Their lexicons were not expansive, but were consistent enough to create common understanding. The power of these mini-lexicons lay not in their size, but in their stability. Once a word was shared and remembered, it became a tool as real as a stone blade. It could carry meaning across distance, across time, and across generations. Around the fire, sound was no longer just survival signal or ritual chant. It was beginning to take the shape of language itself, syllable by syllable, word by word. If stable words began to form in the firelight, then the question becomes, how did these miniature lexicons shape daily cooperation and the passing of knowledge? Hunting provides one of the clearest settings. Coordinating large game hunts required more than instinct and gesture. A small set of stable words could sharpen precision. A short call tied to a particular animal might direct attention during a chase. Another could signal a flank or a halt. The evidence from Ice Age kill sites, where groups of sapiens brought down bison, antelope, or horses, implies teamwork of a scale that gestures alone may not have sustained. Words woven into these hunts would have been as valuable as stone points, guiding the group with consistency across time and terrain. Foraging and gathering carried similar demands. A reliable word for a plant, nut, or root could make it easier to share discoveries. If someone located a patch of edible bulbs, repeating the same sound each time would help others learn and remember. Over generations, such sounds could stabilize into markers for recurring resources, expanding the group's lexicon in practical directions. This process mirrors how children today attach words to objects through repetition, gradually expanding vocabulary through reinforcement. Teaching was another domain where stable words likely flourished. Toolmaking, central to sapiens' life, required both demonstration and instruction. A repeated sound tied to a specific step flake, strike, or edge could help apprentices follow more closely. Archaeological continuity in stone tool traditions suggests that skills were transmitted with precision. Stable vocal labels may have been part of the invisible structure that allowed this transmission to endure. Lexicons also shaped social life. A word tied to kinship, perhaps for mother or child, would have strengthened bonds within the group. Names could distinguish individuals, marking identity in a way gestures alone could not. Anthropological studies of small-scale societies today show how personal names anchor kinship and belonging. If proto-names existed in Ice Age groups, they would have deepened the social fabric, carrying identity in both voice and memory. The firelight itself encouraged this repetition. Gatherings at night provided hours for stories, chants, and practice. The same sounds repeated again and again across generations would become fixed until they felt as natural as breath. This stability turned sound into tradition. Words were no longer just spontaneous cries, but inherited tools, shaping communication as reliably as stone-shaped tools. The evidence is indirect, but the convergence of archaeology, cognitive science, and analogy builds a strong case. Miniature lexicons of stable words likely transformed how sapiens hunted, gathered, taught, and bonded. In the Firelight, language was not yet complete, but its architecture was rising, word by word. If words began to guide hunts and teaching, then the question is how these miniature lexicons reached beyond the practical into memory, ritual, and story. Ritual settings provide the strongest clues. A burial coloured with ochre or adorned with beads likely carried not only objects, but also sound. Stable words may have been spoken to mark the identity of the dead, repeated by many mouths in chorus. Even if the vocabulary was small, the repetition of names or cries could bind the group together, transforming mourning into memory. Such rituals hint that lexicons were not limited to survival tasks. They became instruments of belonging, echoing through generations. Cultural memory also found support in these early words. A repeated label for a river, cave, or valley allowed groups to preserve geographic knowledge. Over time, these names could accumulate, mapping the landscape in sound. This vocal cartography meant that memory was no longer tied only to individual experience. Shared lexicons allowed information to outlast the speaker, embedding knowledge within the group itself. The Firelight amplified this process. Evenings brought hours of talk, gesture, and chant. Proto-words repeated in rhythm may have formed the backbone of early storytelling. A performance of a hunt, combining gesture with sound, could use stable labels for animals, tools, or places. These proto-narratives may not have had grammar as we know it, but they carried the essence of story, sequence, character, and meaning. Archaeologists cannot recover these performances, but the universality of storytelling in later cultures suggests their deep roots. Teaching, ritual, and memory together forged tradition. Stable lexicons were not just practical tools, they became cultural anchors. A child who learned a word for water or fire was not only learning survival, but entering a shared heritage of sound. Each repeated word stitched individuals into the continuity of their group. This convergence of voice, memory, and ritual shows why the Firelight lexicons matter. They mark the transition from fleeting signals to words with endurance. In those small sets of shared vocabulary, the architecture of language was taking shape. Each word was fragile, vanishing into the air as it was spoken. Yet through repetition, each word gained persistence, echoing across nights and generations, until it became part of culture itself. From proto-words scattered in the African night, Homo sapiens built the first miniature dictionaries of shared meaning. Around the fire, voices began to carry not only instructions but stories, not only warnings but names. In that glow, language was no longer only a possibility, it was becoming a tradition, forged in sound and carried in breath. The Firelight lexicons showed how words began to stabilize into tradition, but before grammar wove them into structured sentences, another force bound people together. That force was music. Why did rhythm and proto-song come before grammar? And how did they shape the path toward language? Archaeological and anthropological clues suggest that music is as ancient as our species. The earliest instruments, flutes carved from bone at sites like Hohlefels in Germany, date back at least 40,000 years. But the behaviours they represent must be far older. Long before the first flute, the human voice was capable of melody and rhythm. Around the fires of the Ice Age, proto-songs may have been sung before structured speech existed, carrying emotion, memory, and identity across generations. The universality of music in modern cultures strengthens this idea. Every known society has songs, chants, and rhythmic traditions. Infants respond instinctively to lullabies, swaying and calming at their sound. This universality points to deep evolutionary roots. If music exists everywhere, then it likely existed long before grammar was born. What purpose did it serve? Music does not sharpen a blade or light a fire, yet it strengthens bonds in ways as crucial as tools. When voices rise together in rhythm, individuals feel part of something larger. Modern studies show that group singing can synchronize heartbeats and release endorphins, fostering trust and cohesion. If this is true today, It likely held true in prehistory. Proto-songs may have been tools of cooperation, aligning emotions in groups that needed unity to survive. Music also aids memory. Repetition and melody make it easier to remember sequences, whether of words, actions, or events. A chant could preserve hunting strategies, seasonal knowledge, or ritual practices. Even before grammar, proto-songs may have stabilized memory, carrying culture across generations. Archaeological evidence of symbolic behavior beads, ochre, burials, suggests that these practices were accompanied by sound. Music would have been the natural companion to such rituals, reinforcing meaning through rhythm and emotion. Emotion itself was central. A cry of mourning, repeated in chorus, becomes a lament. A joyful hum shared by many becomes a song of celebration. These expressions do not require grammar. They require only voice, breath, and shared feeling. In this sense, proto-songs may have been humanity's first art, shaping identity long before words could describe it. The evidence cannot capture melodies sung in the Ice Age night. Yet the combination of universality, emotional power, and archaeological traces makes the case strong. Before sentences structured thought, music structured community. Proto-songs wove memory and emotion together, carrying culture forward in sound. If proto-songs bound people through rhythm and memory, then the question is how they shaped the rituals and daily lives of early sapiens. Ritual provides the clearest context. Archaeological sites with burials marked by ochre, beads, and careful placement of bodies suggest that ceremonies accompanied death. To imagine silence at these moments is difficult. More likely, voices rose together in chants or melodic cries, weaving emotion into sound. Even with limited vocabulary, proto-songs could have carried meaning, mourning, farewell, or continuity. Rhythm would have amplified the act, uniting the group in a shared expression of grief or reverence. Celebrations, too, may have been framed by music. The successful return from a hunt, the birth of a child, or the gathering of groups at seasonal sites all offered occasions for collective expression. Here, proto-songs could become markers of joy, echoing through valleys and caves. Laughter, clapping, and repeated melodies may have been the earliest festivals, creating traditions long before grammar organized words into stories. Storytelling itself was likely musical before it was linguistic. A reenactment of a hunt or a journey might have been accompanied by rhythm, chants, or melodic calls. The voice, rising and falling in patterns, could suggest sequence and emotion without needing structured grammar. Over time, proto-songs may have laid the scaffolding for narrative, carrying the shape of stories before words filled them with detail. The connection between music and memory is especially important. Modern experiments show that melodies improve recall. Songs help us remember sequences, lists, and instructions more easily than speech alone. If this is true today, it must have been invaluable in prehistory. Proto-songs could preserve knowledge about migration routes, seasonal changes, or tool-making techniques. Knowledge framed in rhythm and melody would survive more reliably than knowledge carried only in fleeting speech. Emotional resilience was another gift of music. Life in the Ice Age was filled with hardship, dangerous hunts, harsh climates, and constant threats. Group singing or chanting may have reduced stress and built solidarity. Modern parallels show how music can help people endure pain, work longer, and recover from loss. Proto-songs may have offered the same benefits to early humans, transforming fear into courage and loneliness into connection. Archaeological echoes of these practices remain in the form of early instruments. Flutes, carved from bird bone and mammoth ivory, though appearing later, confirm that humans eventually formalized musical traditions. Yet the roots of these traditions must reach back into the proto-songs of firelit nights. Before the first instrument, the human voice was already an instrument, weaving survival with rhythm and ritual. What emerges is a picture of music as both memory and medicine. Proto-songs carried knowledge while easing hardship, shaping not only how humans survived, but how they endured together. If proto-songs preserved memory and eased hardship, then the question is how they shaped the transition towards structured language. Rhythm and melody create patterns that can be repeated, and repetition is the foundation of learning. When early humans chanted proto-words in rhythm, they not only reinforced memory, but also began to impose order on sound. The voice, guided by music, started to explore sequence, building the scaffolding upon which grammar would later rest. Music did not need grammar to carry meaning, but in organizing sound, it prepared the human mind to think in patterns of syntax. Evidence from child development supports this idea. Infants often sing before they speak in sentences, producing melodic babbles that parents recognize as precursors to language. These proto-songs train memory, rhythm, and social connection before grammar takes shape. If every child today passes through this stage, it is likely that our species once did too. The fires of the Ice Age may have been filled with the same melodic rehearsals that echo in nurseries today. Ritual further reinforced the role of proto-songs. Ceremonies required repetition, stability, and shared participation. Chants created frameworks where words could slowly accumulate. A ritual cry for water might evolve into a repeated phrase, then into a string of proto-words. Over generations, these strings could stabilize into rules, paving the way for the earliest grammar. Music, in this sense, was not only expression but also rehearsal for language itself. The emotional force of music also encouraged its persistence. Grammar may structure thought, but music stirs feeling. A song can unite groups across distances, carry comfort into grief, or inspire courage in conflict. The universality of these effects suggests deep evolutionary roots. If proto-songs carried such weight in the past, they would have been difficult to abandon. Instead, they became companions to language, surviving even as grammar emerged. Archaeological finds of flutes and resonant spaces in caves support this continuity. Humans chose places where sound echoed, carving instruments and marking walls with pigment. These settings suggest performances where voice and symbol combined. Even if grammar had not yet taken form, proto-songs gave structure to sound and meaning to ritual. The leap into language was already underway, carried by melody and rhythm. What we glimpse in this stage is not the replacement of song by language, but their partnership. Music carried memory and emotion. Language, when it arrived, carried detail and abstraction. Together, they shaped the uniquely human capacity for culture. Proto-songs did not vanish when grammar appeared. They became its foundation, ensuring that words would always carry rhythm and that stories would always be spoken with cadence. Through proto-songs, early humans rehearsed the future. Their voices, rising together in rhythm, carved the path that grammar would later follow, ensuring that language was not only thought but music. Proto-songs carried memory and bound groups together, yet melody alone could not hold every detail of human experience. The human voice began searching for new structures, ways to order sounds into patterns that carried meaning beyond rhythm and emotion. How did scattered grunts and proto-words transform into the first grammar, giving humans the power to weave complexity into their speech? The archaeological record cannot show us the moment when grammar appeared. Bones and tools do not preserve syntax, but indirect clues suggest when speech grew more structured. Around 50 to 60,000 years ago, Homo sapiens spread across Africa and began migrating into new lands. This expansion required coordination on a scale larger than small bands. Knowledge of routes, landscapes, and strategies had to be shared with precision. Gesture and proto-words were not enough. Stable rules of speech may have arisen under these pressures, enabling groups to carry memory across distance. Linguists studying language origins point to the importance of word order. Grammar allows ideas to be combined, distinguishing between who acted and who received the action. Without grammar, a proto-word for lion and another for attack could convey danger, but not specify whether humans hunted lions or lions hunted humans. The ability to order words turned ambiguous cries into structured meaning. This shift expanded communication from immediate survival to shared storytelling. Cognitive evidence supports this view. Modern children, after mastering individual words, soon begin to experiment with word order, creating simple sentences like want food, or go home. These two-word combinations emerge before complex grammar, but show the mind's instinct to impose order. The pattern suggests that once sapiens developed larger lexicons, grammar followed naturally, shaped by the same cognitive tendencies we see in children today. Ritual settings may also have encouraged grammar's rise. Proto-songs provided repetition, but repetition invites elaboration. Adding words in sequence could create phrases, and phrases could stabilize into patterns. A chant of names, animals, or places might have grown into a structured performance, laying the groundwork for syntax. Music and grammar may not have been separate paths, but entwined ones, each feeding the other. Archaeological finds of ochre, beads, and engraved stones point to symbolic minds, but grammar reveals a different level of abstraction. It is one thing to mark identity with pigment or name it with a proto-word. It is another to tell a story about how something happened, who did it, and when. Grammar opened this door, allowing sapiens to describe not only the world around them, but also events stretched across time. The evidence is circumstantial, but the convergence of migration, cognition, and culture makes the case strong. Grammar likely emerged not as a sudden invention, but as a slow layering of order onto sound, transforming scattered grunts into structures capable of carrying thought. If grammar allowed sapiens to specify who did what to whom, then the question is how this new structure transformed storytelling, teaching, and the sharing of memory. Storytelling was the most profound change. Proto-words could label, and proto-songs could evoke, but grammar allowed the weaving of events into sequence. A speaker could now describe not only lion and hunt, but "we hunted the lion by the river yesterday." This shift gave depth to communication, stretching it across time and space. Around the fire, groups could reconstruct hunts, recall dangers, and imagine possibilities. In this way, grammar carried experience beyond the present, binding generations with narrative. Teaching also gained new precision. Toolmaking had always required demonstration, but structured speech allowed instructions to extend beyond what was visible. Instead of repeating a single proto-word for flake, a teacher could combine words to explain order. Strike this stone before that one. Archaeological continuity in blade traditions across thousands of years suggests that skills were transmitted with great fidelity. Grammar may have been one of the invisible tools preserving that fidelity, ensuring knowledge was remembered not only by imitation but by explanation. Cultural memory expanded as well. With grammar, groups could preserve myths, rituals, and traditions in forms that endured. A chant with ordered words could encode a story of origins, a sequence of tasks, or a moral lesson. These narratives reinforced identity, giving communities a shared past and imagined future. Archaeological hints of symbolic complexity in cave art and ritual burials align with this timeline, suggesting that grammar and symbolic culture grew together, feeding one another. The rise of grammar also deepened cooperation. Words ordered into sentences could clarify roles in hunts, migrations, and construction. Ambiguity gave way to precision. A leader could describe not only what to do, but how and when to do it. This precision may have contributed to the remarkable success of sapiens as they expanded into diverse environments, coordinating large groups with flexible systems of command. Yet grammar was not only a tool of survival, it also reshaped imagination. The ability to describe what did not yet exist to speak of tomorrow, or of a place unseen, expanded the horizons of thought. Grammar enabled hypotheticals, allowing humans to plan, dream, and warn of possibilities. This leap distinguished sapiens from other species. Even if Neanderthals had proto-words or songs, the layering of structured syntax may have given sapiens an unmatched edge in abstraction. The evidence cannot reveal the first grammatical sentence, nor the first time a sequence of words carried a full story. But the indirect record, the expansion of sapiens, the continuity of culture, the depth of symbolic practices, suggests that grammar was emerging in parallel with art and ritual, reshaping what it meant to be human. If grammar reshaped cooperation and imagination, then the question is how it anchored identity and laid the groundwork for the diversity of languages that followed. One of grammar's most powerful effects was on myth. Once humans could order words into sequences, they could tell not only what happened, but why it mattered. Myths framed origins, explained natural forces, and offered meaning to life and death. Archaeological sites with cave paintings and ritual burials hint at such narratives. A figure painted on a wall may have been more than an image. It may have been part of a story recited with structured speech, passed down to bind the group together. Grammar allowed these stories to take form, ensuring they could be remembered in detail and retold across generations. Identity also deepened through grammar. Proto-words could mark individuals with names, but structured speech could describe relationships, obligations, and histories. Families and bands could define themselves through shared narratives, not just shared sounds. Language became a vessel of kinship, weaving bonds that reached beyond bloodlines into culture. This capacity for expansive identity may have been critical as sapiens spread across continents, forming alliances and larger networks. Grammar also created the possibility of difference. As groups dispersed into new environments, their shared lexicons and grammatical patterns began to diverge. Over thousands of years, these divergences gave rise to distinct languages. What began as small variations in word order or vocabulary hardened into linguistic frontiers, marking groups as distinct. In this way, grammar was not only a unifying force, but also a dividing one, shaping the patchwork of languages that still characterizes humanity today. The emergence of grammar also strengthened memory through ritualized speech. Ceremonial chants could now carry structured sequences, embedding moral lessons or cosmological ideas. Oral tradition became a library without walls, preserved in the memories of elders and renewed each time words were spoken. This oral library held the seeds of philosophy, law, and religion, long before writing captured them in stone or clay. From a biological perspective, grammar may have also fed back into cognition. The ability to order words into sequences reinforced the ability to think in sequences, sharpening problem-solving and planning. In this sense, grammar did not only describe thought, it shaped it. The recursive possibilities of language, the ability to embed clauses within clauses, expanded the human mind into realms no other species had reached. What began as grunts and cries had become structured patterns capable of carrying myth, law, and memory. The human voice was no longer bound to the present. It could now carry the past and imagine the future, binding groups together in stories and setting them apart in languages. Grammar was not only a tool of survival, it was the architecture of culture itself. Grammar had given humans the ability to tell stories and carry memory with new depth. But those stories did not stay in one place. As bands of Homo sapiens began to move outward from Africa, their shared vocabularies and rules of speech slowly fractured into new forms. How did migration across continents set the stage for the first divergence of tongues? Archaeological and genetic evidence suggests that the first major expansions of Homo sapiens out of Africa occurred between 60 and 70,000 years ago. Groups followed coastlines, rivers, and valleys, eventually reaching the Arabian Peninsula, South Asia, and beyond. Each band carried its own lexicon and patterns of speech. As they settled in new environments, separated by deserts, mountains, and oceans, their voices began to drift apart. What once had been a common pool of sounds started to split, producing the earliest language families. This process of divergence is familiar to us today. Modern linguistics shows how even within a few generations, groups, separated by geography, can develop new dialects. Over centuries, these dialects can evolve into distinct languages. If this happened so quickly in historical times, it must have happened even more profoundly across the vast stretches of prehistory. The evidence is indirect, but the logic is strong. Migration created distance. Distance created difference. Archaeological sites along these migration routes show the cultural continuity of sapiens. Stone tools shaped in the Middle Stone Age tradition appear from Africa to Arabia and India, suggesting that groups carried knowledge with them. Yet knowledge is always transmitted through communication. As tool traditions spread, so too must have the words that named them. And as distance widened, those words must have changed. A proto-word for water may have shifted in sound as one group moved into a new climate, while another word for fire may have transformed in cadence across the sea. The environments themselves shaped this divergence. In Africa, proto-words may have been tied to savannas and rivers. In Asia, groups encountered monsoons, new plants, and unfamiliar animals. Each encounter required new labels, new sounds to be stabilized within the group. Over time, these vocabularies expanded and diverged, reshaping the soundscapes of language. Genetic studies add another layer. Traces of ancient population splits can be seen in the genomes of living people, aligning with the timeline of migrations. These genetic divergences parallel what must have been linguistic divergences. We cannot hear the voices of those early migrants, but the living diversity of languages today, over 7,000 across the globe, speaks of a process that began in these Ice Age journeys. The Firelight lexicons had once been shared within bands. Now they were scattering across continents, adapting to landscapes as varied as deserts, forests, and coasts. Language was no longer a single thread, it was beginning to braid into many. If migration scattered groups across continents, then the question is how isolation and environment deepened the divergence of their speech. Geographic barriers were among the strongest forces. Once bands were separated by deserts, mountain ranges, or seas, their shared words no longer echoed between them. Without contact, sounds began to drift. Dialects that might have remained mutually intelligible in close quarters hardened into distinct languages across distance. This is the same process we see today, where related tongues like Spanish and Italian share roots but differ through centuries of separation. In the Ice Age, the timescales were vast and the distances immense. Environments also shaped vocabularies. Groups entering new landscapes encountered unfamiliar plants, animals, and climates. Words had to be coined for snow in northern regions, for tropical rains in southern forests, for tools crafted to meet new challenges. Each environment seeded new vocabularies that did not exist in the savannas of Africa. These words multiplied over generations, and their growth widened the gap between groups. Cultural practices reinforced the process. Symbolic traditions, ochre markings, beads, and burials spread outward with sapiens, but they evolved locally. A community in Arabia may have painted with pigments found along coasts, while one in Europe used ochre from inland valleys. The practices remained recognizably human, yet their details diverged. The same would have been true for speech. Shared patterns of grammar endured, but words and sounds shifted with cultural expression. Social identity added another dimension. Language is not only communication, but also a marker of belonging. As groups defined themselves against outsiders, subtle differences in speech may have been exaggerated into boundaries. A slight change in word order or pronunciation could become a badge of identity. Over time, these differences accumulated, creating linguistic frontiers as real as any geographic one. The archaeological record hints at these divisions. Tool traditions in different regions retain similarities but also show local styles. Decorative objects, while common across sapien sites, reveal regional variations. These material differences likely reflected linguistic ones as well. A bead carved in one valley may have been named with a word that no longer matched its counterpart hundreds of kilometers away. Modern linguistic diversity echoes this prehistoric branching. Families of languages today can often be traced to shared ancestors thousands of years old. Indo-European, Bantu, and Austronesian tongues all spread through migrations, splitting into dozens or hundreds of related languages. Though these lineages are much later, they reveal the same process that must have unfolded during the first great dispersals of sapiens. What began as a shared lexicon around African fires was now evolving into distinct tongues across continents. Each new valley, coast, or plain gave rise to new words. Each barrier of distance gave those words time to change. The result was a growing mosaic of languages, as varied as the landscapes in which they were spoken. If distance and environment set tongues on different paths, then the question is how these divergent languages became anchors of culture and identity. Language is more than a tool of communication. It carries myths, rituals, and the rhythm of daily life. As groups settled into new lands, their tongues preserved their histories and shaped their futures. A word for a sacred mountain or river could root a group in its landscape. A phrase repeated in ritual could tie generations together. Over time, languages became cultural vessels, holding not only names, but entire worldviews. Archaeological traces suggest this layering of meaning. Cave art in Europe, ochre engravings in Africa, and ornaments in Asia all show symbolic traditions thriving in diverse regions. Each tradition must have been accompanied by its own spoken frames, unique words that described the images, objects, and rituals. Though we cannot recover the sounds, the material record hints at the stories they carried. Identity was reinforced through these languages. As groups met and mingled at boundaries, differences in speech could mark who belonged and who did not. A unique word or phrase may have acted as a password of kinship, distinguishing insiders from outsiders, just as dialects today reveal regional identity. Ice Age tongues likely signaled affiliation in a world where belonging meant survival. The branching of tongues also enabled diversity of thought. Each language structures the world in slightly different ways. Word order, vocabulary, and metaphor shape perception. By diverging, human groups created multiple lenses through which to see reality. This diversity may have enriched the species, fostering creativity, resilience, and adaptation. What one group encoded in chant, another might express in metaphor, and both would carry meaning vital to survival. The evidence of this process lingers in the sheer scale of modern linguistic diversity. Over 7,000 languages are spoken today, each tracing back to ancient divergences. While most cannot be followed directly into the Ice Age, their existence demonstrates how long and deeply humans have sustained linguistic variety. The mosaic of tongues we see now is the inheritance of those first splits as sapiens spread outward from Africa. Divergent tongues also laid the foundation for future cultural exchange. When groups met after long separations, their different languages forced negotiation, borrowing, or hybridization. These encounters enriched vocabularies and spread ideas, weaving networks of connection across continents. Language divergence did not isolate humanity entirely. It created variety, and variety fostered interaction. From Africa to Asia, from coasts to mountains, the divergence of tongues reshaped humanity. Shared lexicons fractured into lineages, each carrying memory, ritual, and identity into new landscapes. What began as one voice had become many. The story of language was no longer a single thread, but a tapestry woven from countless tongues, each echoing the journeys of those who carried them. The divergence of tongues showed how Homo sapiens scattered their voices across new landscapes. But sapiens were not the only ones speaking in the Ice Age world. Neanderthals still thrived in Europe and Western Asia, and Denisovans occupied vast ranges in the East. What would it have sounded like to walk through that world, where more than one human species spoke, chanted, and sang? The archaeological record suggests that these species overlapped for tens of thousands of years. Neanderthals occupied Europe for more than 300,000 years, leaving behind tools, pigments, and burials that suggest symbolic culture. Denisovans, known largely from genetic traces and a handful of bones in Siberia and Tibet, shared ancestry with both Neanderthals and Sapiens. And Sapiens, emerging from Africa and spreading across Eurasia, carried their own developing lexicons. These overlapping populations created a chorus of human voices, though none of those voices can be directly heard. Neanderthals likely spoke with deeper, more resonant tones, as reconstructions of their vocal tracts suggest. Their FOXP2 gene, shared with sapiens, points to capacities for structured speech. The evidence is thin, but suggests they may have used words or proto-words in ways comparable to early sapiens. Their burials and pigments hint at ritual, which in nearly all human cultures is tied to sound. To imagine their world without chant or cry is to overlook the emotional force that ritual requires. Denisovans are harder to reconstruct, yet their genetic legacy reveals influence across wide regions. Populations in Melanesia, Tibet, and Southeast Asia still carry Denisovan DNA, showing that they once thrived in diverse habitats. We cannot know the quality of their voices, but if they shared genetic adaptations with Neanderthals, it is reasonable to infer that they too could produce a range of sounds sufficient for symbolic communication. Their environment, mountains, forests, steppes, would have echoed with their voices, just as it did for sapiens and Neanderthals. The coexistence of three human species raises profound questions about contact. Did their voices meet? Did sapiens hear Neanderthals chant by a riverbank? Or Denisovans call across a mountain pass? Encounters between groups surely occurred, as genetic evidence of interbreeding shows. Those meetings were not only physical, but also vocal. Sounds would have carried across Firelight, marking both similarity and difference. This was the Ice Age Polyphony. Three species, three voices, overlapping in time and space. Their languages, if we can call them that, may not have been mutually intelligible. Yet each carried memory, ritual, and belonging. The soundscape of the late Pleistocene was not a solo performance, but a chorus, layered with voices that would eventually converge into us. When three species shared Ice Age landscapes, how often did their voices overlap, and what might those encounters have sounded like? The evidence for contact is undeniable. Genetic studies show that sapiens interbred with both Neanderthals and Denisovans. These exchanges left traces still visible in modern populations, from immune system adaptations linked to Neanderthals to high-altitude traits in Tibetans linked to Denisovans. Such interbreeding implies encounters close enough for intimacy. If bodies came together, voices must have as well. We cannot know whether those voices traded words, but sound surely bridged the silence between species. Practical necessity may have driven some of this communication. When groups crossed paths at hunting grounds, water sources, or migration routes, conflict was possible, but so was negotiation. A raised hand, a pointed gesture, or a repeated sound might have conveyed warning or request. Shared environments created shared pressures, and even without mutual language, sound could carry intention. Modern examples among humans show how quickly groups can develop pigeon-like systems to communicate across barriers. It is plausible that sapiens, Neanderthals, and Denisovans did the same, improvising vocal bridges in moments of contact. Archaeological evidence hints at cultural parallels. Neanderthals and sapiens both used pigments, shaped ornaments, and buried their dead. If their material practices were so similar, then their vocal practices may have been as well. The same could be true of Denisovans, though their record is sparse. Such overlaps suggest not only shared ancestry but shared modes of symbolic thought. If symbolism existed, then voices must have carried it in chants, in proto-songs, in cries of ritual. But encounters would not have been purely harmonious. Voices may also have marked difference, serving as boundaries between groups. The cadence of speech, the pitch of chant, the rhythm of proto-songs could signal identity as clearly as beads or pigments. A sapiens group hearing Neanderthal speech might have recognized its strangeness, even as it recognized its humanity. These moments of near understanding may have been charged with both fear and fascination. What cannot be recovered is the sound itself. We do not know the timbre of a Neanderthal lullaby, nor the resonance of a Denisovan chant. Yet the genetic and archaeological evidence tells us that these sounds existed. They filled forests, valleys, and mountains with meaning. To walk through Ice Age Eurasia would not have been to hear a single human tongue, but to hear many sometimes clashing, sometimes blending, always shaping the soundscape of prehistory. The chorus of species did not last. Over time, sapiens became the only surviving voice. But for tens of thousands of years, polyphony defined the human condition, reminding us that our story was once sung in many tones. As the chorus of species echoed across Ice Age landscapes, what became of those voices when only one lineage endured? The archaeological record shows that by 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals had disappeared from most of Europe, and Denisovans lingered only in scattered strongholds of Asia. The reasons for their disappearance remain debated. climate shifts, competition, or absorption into sapiens populations. Yet their voices did not vanish entirely. Genetic evidence proves that encounters left echoes within us, from immune adaptations to high-altitude resilience. Every person today carries fragments of their legacy, faint reminders that our ancestors once spoke and sang alongside others. The cultural echoes are harder to trace, yet they are equally compelling. Sapiens expanding into Europe and Asia may have borrowed not only genes but also ideas, tools, and perhaps even sounds. A chant, a ritual cry, or a melodic pattern could have passed between groups, carried into the sapiens' repertoire. Archaeology cannot capture the tones of such exchanges, but it can show us shared practices, pigments used by both sapiens and Neanderthals, ornaments shaped across regions, burials marked by deliberate care. These parallels suggest that the soundscapes of ritual may also have overlapped. As polyphony faded, sapiens inherited a world once shared, yet the memory of multiple voices lingers in our imagination. Myths of other beings, giants, spirits, ancestors, may echo faint memories of living alongside those who were like us yet different. Stories told in caves may have carried not only the voices of sapiens, but the ghostly remembrance of others who had once sung under the same stars. The persistence of music in human culture underscores this inheritance. Polyphony in song, multiple voices layered together, may unconsciously reflect the reality of our deep past. For tens of millennia, humanity was not a soloist, but part of a chorus. Even though only one voice remains today, the idea of harmony, of multiple tones carried together, continues to resonate in our traditions. What we cannot know are the precise sounds themselves, the cadence of a Neanderthal lullaby, the rhythm of a Denisovan chant, the words of a sapiens story exchanged across a valley. But we can be certain that the Ice Age was filled with voices more diverse than our own, a polyphony of species bound by breath, sound, and meaning. Their songs ended, but their echoes live on within us, genetically, culturally, and imaginatively. The silence that followed was not the silence of extinction alone. It was also the silence of absorption, of memory carried forward in fragments. When sapiens became the only singers, they carried within their throats and lungs the faint resonance of all the voices that had come before. The chorus of Ice Age voices faded until only sapiens remained, but the echoes of that polyphony carried forward. With sapiens alone shaping language, sound became more stable, more intricate, and more enduring. How do we trace the faint roots of words that may have survived from those distant times into the languages we speak today? Linguists attempt this through a field called linguistic paleontology. It does not unearth bones or beads, but instead digs through vocabularies, searching for patterns that hint at ancient origins. Words for natural elements, for family, for basic tools and actions often prove the most resilient. In many language families, terms for mother and father share similar sounds, echoing across continents. These patterns suggest that some proto-words of the Ice Age did not vanish entirely, but left their imprints within our modern tongues. One of the most studied examples is the reconstructed Proto-Indo-European language, spoken perhaps 6,000 years ago across Eurasia. Linguists working backward through its descendants, Greek, Sanskrit, Latin, and many more, have rebuilt fragments of its lexicon. Words for water, fire, and family recur with striking similarity, pointing to deep ancestry. These reconstructions cannot reach all the way back to the Ice Age, but they demonstrate the principle. Sounds leave fossils too, not in stone but in speech. Some linguists attempt to push further, speculating about ultra-conserved words that may stretch back 15,000 years or more. Studies comparing Eurasian languages have identified shared roots for terms like hand, fire, or to flow. The evidence is debated and uncertain, but it suggests that certain words are so useful, so central to human survival, that they endure across millennia. If that is true, then the sounds spoken in Ice Age camps may still echo faintly in our own speech. Archaeology anchors this speculation with context. Sites such as Dolny Věstonice in the Czech Republic or Sungir in Russia reveal complex Ice Age societies with burials, ornaments, and communal structures. These communities must have had rich vocabularies to sustain their cultures. We cannot recover the syllables, but we can infer their presence from the complexity of the lives they lived. A society capable of weaving textiles, shaping ivory beads, and coordinating long-distance trade surely had words for those acts. The poetic challenge is that these words are lost to us, yet their shadows remain. When we speak of water, when we whisper, "mother," we may be touching faint echoes of syllables shaped in Ice Age breath. The evidence is fragile, but it suggests that language itself holds memory, carrying pieces of the deep past in every conversation we have today. If words can leave traces across millennia, what methods allow us to reconstruct fragments of languages spoken long before writing existed? Comparative linguistics provides the main tool. By setting related languages side by side, scholars identify patterns of sound change that move in regular steps. A P in one tongue may become an F in another, as in the shift from Latin pater to English father. By charting these shifts across dozens of languages, linguists can rebuild the outlines of ancestral vocabularies. These reconstructions are not guesses but systematic deductions, grounded in observed rules of sound change. Proto-Indo-European is the most famous reconstruction, but many others exist. Proto-Bantu has been reconstructed for much of sub-Saharan Africa, Proto-Austronesian for the island networks of the Pacific, Proto-Uralic for northern Eurasia. Each reconstruction reveals the durability of certain words. Terms for body parts, kinship, numbers, and natural elements often persist, while words for technology or abstract concepts change more quickly. This pattern suggests that the Ice Age lexicons of sapiens were likely anchored by stable cores of vocabulary centered on family, environment, and survival. Linguistic paleontology goes further by using reconstructed words to infer aspects of ancient life. If a proto-language has a common word for snow, its speakers likely lived in cold regions. If it has terms for boat or ocean, seafaring was part of their culture. These inferences allow researchers to sketch the world in which ancestral words were spoken. Though speculative, the method builds bridges between sound and archaeology. The challenge is temporal depth. Most reconstructions reach back several thousand years, but the Ice Age lies tens of thousands of years beyond. Direct reconstruction is impossible at that scale. Still, patterns of ultra-conserved words, those thought to endure for 15,000 years or more, offer tantalizing hints. Studies comparing distant Eurasian languages have suggested that words like thou, mother, hand, and fire may trace to common Ice Age roots. Critics caution against overconfidence, yet the possibility is compelling that when we speak these words today, we echo syllables our ancestors shaped around Ice Age fires. Archaeological context strengthens this vision. The survival strategies of Ice Age groups hunting megafauna, weaving nets, carving bone tools demanded coordinated communication. If certain tasks were constant across generations, the words tied to them may have been equally stable. Repeated across centuries, such words could form the backbone of enduring lexicons. Even as dialects diverged, some sounds may have remained, carried forward like faint fossils in the breath of speech. The picture that emerges is not of frozen vocabularies, but of living systems, shifting and adapting, yet carrying ancient cores. Through comparative methods, we glimpse not exact sentences, but the shape of the words that bound communities together long before writing captured them. If echoes of Ice Age words survive within modern speech, what does that mean for the way we understand the voices of our ancestors? The persistence of certain words suggests that language itself is a vessel of memory. When we say mother, we join a lineage of sounds stretching back not only through recorded history, but possibly into prehistory. Across cultures, words for kinship often share similar syllables. Ma, pa, na patterns that infants can easily produce and adults easily recognize. These sounds may have stabilized tens of thousands of years ago, surviving in countless tongues as anchors of human connection. Other terms, tied to the natural world, reveal similar endurance. Water, fire, hand, and stone are concepts central to every culture. The reconstructed roots of these words in multiple language families suggest deep ancestry. While the precise phonetics have shifted, the continuity of meaning reveals a thread linking us to Ice Age speech. These words are not fossils frozen in place, but living echoes, reshaped by time yet still recognizable. The survival of words also underscores the social fabric of language. Each repeated term was passed from parent to child, elder to apprentice, lover to companion. In every exchange, the word was renewed. Over thousands of generations, this repetition created chains of memory strong enough to stretch across millennia. The endurance of certain words is not only a linguistic fact, but also a testament to the persistence of human relationships. Archaeological evidence of Ice Age life adds depth to this picture. Communities at Dolny Viestanis crafted clay figurines. At Sungir, they adorned the dead with beads. At Blombos, they carved ochre with designs. Each of these acts must have been accompanied by words, labels for objects, names for rituals, instructions for craft. We cannot recover the syllables, but when we speak words tied to similar domains today, we may be walking in their footsteps, echoing sounds once shaped in the same spirit. The idea that words carry memory reshapes how we hear our own speech. Everyday terms, often taken for granted, may be among the oldest things we possess. They outlast tools, shelters, and even bones. A single syllable whispered in the Ice Age could survive, transformed but recognizable, in the conversations we hold now. This continuity binds us not only to our ancestors, but also to each other, as living carriers of an unbroken chain of sound. The first recognizable words were more than labels. They were bridges of time, carrying survival, identity, and emotion. In every language spoken today, fragments of that ancient chorus remain, reminding us that when we speak, we do so with voices rooted in the deep past. The first recognizable words tied us to echoes of the Ice Age, but those echoes did not remain unified. As sapiens spread farther across the world, distance and isolation fractured their shared speech. How did a single ancestral voice diversify into the thousands of languages that came to cover the globe? The timeline of dispersal provides a framework. By 60,000 years ago, bands of sapiens had begun moving out of Africa in multiple waves. Some followed coastlines into Arabia and India, others pressed into the Levant, and later movements reached Europe, East Asia, and Australia. Each group carried fragments of the ancestral lexicon, but separation set change in motion. Without daily contact, words drifted, pronunciations shifted. New terms arose for plants, animals, and tools, encountered in unfamiliar environments. Within a few thousand years, tongues that once shared roots no longer sounded the same. Archaeology supports this picture of divergence. At sites like Lake Mungo in Australia, dated to around 45,000 years ago, evidence of ritual burials reveals complex symbolic lives. In Europe, caves at Chauvet and Lascaux preserve art from around the same time, showing sophisticated storytelling in imagery. Though the art cannot capture sound, it implies that rich vocabularies were being used to frame these cultural practices. Yet the vocabularies in Australia and Europe would not have been identical. The groups were too far apart, separated by oceans and continents. Their voices had already begun to splinter. Linguistic parallels in more recent history help explain the pace of change. When Latin spread with the Roman Empire, it fractured within a few centuries into dialects that later became French, Spanish, Italian, and others. If this occurred in recorded history, with written texts anchoring stability, how much faster must languages have diverged in prehistory when only memory carried sound? The evidence suggests that by the time sapiens occupied every continent except Antarctica, their tongues had already multiplied into countless variations. This diversification was not only geographic, but cultural. Each community shaped its lexicon around what mattered most in its world. In the tundra of Ice Age Siberia, words for snow, ice, and reindeer would have carried great weight. In tropical forests, terms for rain, fruit, and canopy creatures would have dominated. Vocabulary anchored culture to landscape, embedding the environment in sound. Over generations, these words became markers of identity, distinguishing one group from another. The splintering of voices did not weaken humanity. It enriched it. Language became a mirror of adaptation, reflecting the landscapes, rituals, and imaginations of diverse peoples. By the end of the Ice Age, the single ancestral voice of sapiens had already transformed into a chorus of tongues, each carrying its own rhythm of survival and memory. If voices fractured into thousands of tongues, what did this growing diversity mean for identity, unity, and division among early humans? Language quickly became a marker of belonging. A shared tongue bound groups together, reinforcing kinship and cooperation. The same feature that created cohesion also created boundaries. Those who spoke differently could be marked as outsiders, even if they shared ancestry. Anthropological parallels show that in many societies, dialect and accent are as important as dress or ornament in signaling identity. It is likely that Ice Age groups used language in the same way, shaping oral borders between us and them. Archaeological evidence suggests that trade and interaction occurred even across these divides. Beads, shells, and obsidian moved over long distances, showing that groups met, exchanged, and perhaps intermarried. Such contact would have required negotiation. Shared gestures, borrowed words, or pigeon-like systems may have bridged differences. The presence of foreign ornaments in burials shows that objects crossed linguistic boundaries, even if full understanding did not. These exchanges reveal that diversity of tongues did not prevent connection, but made it more complex and layered. The splintering also carried cultural consequences. Each language structured thought in unique ways, emphasizing certain concepts over others. A group whose environment demanded fine distinctions in snow or plant life would encode those distinctions in words. Another group might lack those terms, but have a rich lexicon for rivers, winds, or stars. In this way, language diversity expanded the collective human imagination. It gave rise to multiple perspectives on the world, each preserved in the vocabulary of a tongue. Boundaries, however, were never fixed. Migration brought groups into contact, and tongues borrowed from one another. Linguists call this process diffusion, the spread of sounds, words, or grammatical structures across languages. Even in prehistory, this must have occurred. A group encountering new tools or rituals might borrow not only the practice but also the word that named it. Over time, diffusion layered languages with traces of contact, making each tongue a living record of interactions. Yet isolation also deepened differences. In remote valleys, on islands, or across vast steppes, groups developed languages that drifted further from their neighbours. Modern linguistic diversity reflects this process. Thousands of languages exist today, many spoken by small communities in isolated regions. This pattern likely mirrors the Ice Age, when human populations were scattered but culturally rich. The splintering voices therefore shaped both separation and connection. Language created in-groups and out-groups, distinct identities and shared exchanges. In its diversity, humanity found both division and resilience. The chorus of tongues was not a weakness, but a foundation for cultural complexity, enabling the species to adapt to every environment it encountered. If Ice Age voices diverged into thousands of tongues, how did this diversity shape the myths, traditions, and future languages of humanity? Stories were among the first to take root in this new mosaic of speech. With grammar already in place, and lexicons expanding in every region, humans could now tell longer narratives, weaving events into meaning. Yet because languages diverged, each group's myths developed in its own soundscape. A creation story told in a tundra camp would have sounded different from one sung in a tropical forest clearing. Words shaped not only the content of stories but their rhythm and melody, embedding cultural identity within language itself. Tradition became another vessel of diversity. Ritual chants, burial songs, and seasonal celebrations all relied on repeated sound. But with every split in speech, those traditions became unique to their groups. Archaeology preserves ornaments, pigments, and figurines, but not the chants that accompanied them. Still, The persistence of symbolic practice across continents suggests that language played a vital role, carrying prayers, instructions, and laments in thousands of distinct forms. This diversification also laid the groundwork for the languages of recorded history. By the end of the Ice Age, humans had spread to nearly every habitable region on Earth. Each community carried a tongue shaped by isolation, contact, and adaptation. When agriculture and writing eventually appeared, they captured only a fraction of this linguistic wealth. Most Ice Age languages vanished without trace, yet their influence survived in the branching families of tongues that still connect us to that era. The splintering voices also remind us that language is never static. It is alive, constantly shifting with each generation. In the Ice Age, as now, children grew up modifying the sounds of their elders, adding new words and new inflections. Over centuries, these small changes transformed dialects into languages. The diversity we see today, over 7,000 tongues across the globe, is the living legacy of processes that began in the Ice Age, when humanity's voice first fractured into many. The resilience of language lies in this very diversity. If one tongue vanished, others remained. If one group's stories faded, another's endured. This multiplicity made culture robust, ensuring that memory and meaning could never be silenced by the loss of a single voice. The splintering of tongues was not only a historical inevitability, but a creative force, shaping the richness of human expression. By the close of the Ice Age, humanity no longer spoke with one voice. It spoke with thousands, each carrying the imprint of landscapes, histories, and imaginations. From that polyphony emerged the linguistic diversity we inherit today, a living reminder that our words are not just tools but echoes of the countless tongues that once filled the world. The splintering of voices created a chorus of tongues across the Ice Age world, but language was not only a tool of survival, it became a vessel for memory, carrying stories through time when nothing else could preserve them. How did spoken tradition endure for tens of thousands of years, keeping alive the knowledge, myths, and histories of ancestors who left no writing behind? Archaeology gives us only fragments of this vast oral world. We find beads, burials, pigments, and carvings, but the voices that explained their meaning have vanished into silence. Yet anthropology offers clues. In societies without writing today, oral tradition remains central. Elders recite genealogies, chants preserve laws, and myths explain the origins of rivers, mountains, and stars. These practices show how memory can stretch across centuries through carefully maintained recitation. By analogy, Ice Age groups likely used the same methods, repeating and refining stories until they became woven into the identity of the community. The endurance of oral tradition lies in its structure. Repetition, rhythm, and formulaic patterns make stories easier to remember. A chant about a hunt, framed by recurring lines, could be recalled word for word across generations. Myths encoded in song or ritual performance could survive with remarkable fidelity. Studies of oral epics, such as those passed down in Homeric Greece or among the griots of West Africa, show that entire narratives can be memorized and transmitted for centuries without writing. If this is possible in historical times, it must have been possible in prehistory as well. Oral tradition did more than preserve facts. It carried identity. Stories told around fires bound groups together, reminding them of ancestors, of landscapes, of shared struggles. In the vast stretches of the Ice Age, where groups were scattered and environments harsh, such shared narratives offered stability. They gave meaning to survival, framing the world not only as a place of danger, but as a place filled with memory and continuity. The poetic power of oral tradition also lies in its adaptability. Stories are never fixed. Each telling allows subtle changes, fitting the moment, the audience, or the mood. Over generations, myths evolve while retaining their core. This adaptability ensures relevance while preserving memory. It is likely that Ice Age narratives worked in the same way, fluid, living, but deeply rooted in the past. Though we cannot hear their words, the endurance of oral tradition is evident in the universality of story. From Australia to the Arctic, from deserts to forests, humans tell tales that link them to ancestors. This universality suggests a practice as old as language itself, one that began in the Ice Age and still echoes in us today. If oral tradition preserved identity and myth, how did it also carry the practical knowledge needed to survive across generations? The evidence suggests that memory encoded in spoken story was a vital tool for navigating Ice Age landscapes. Seasonal migrations required knowledge of when herds moved, when rivers froze, or when plants ripened. Such details could not be left to chance. By embedding them in stories, groups ensured that knowledge endured even when individuals did not. A tale of a journey might hold within it the timing of caribou migrations. A myth about a mountain might preserve the location of a crucial water source. The story carried more than meaning, it carried survival. Ethnographic parallels from modern oral cultures reinforce this idea. In Australia, Aboriginal songlines map entire landscapes, encoding directions, waterholes, and sacred sites into musical form. These oral maps have guided travel for tens of thousands of years. It is plausible that Ice Age groups used similar strategies, embedding geography in narrative. A story about an ancestor's path across the land could function as both myth and map, binding memory to place. Hunting strategies, too, could be preserved through story. A chant recalling the steps of a hunt might serve as a teaching tool for younger generations. Oral repetition could reinforce sequences of movement, positions, or tactics. The universality of hunting songs and dances in ethnographic records suggests deep roots. Long before writing, rhythm and voice could preserve the choreography of survival. Environmental memory was equally important. Climate, during the Ice Age, shifted dramatically. Glaciers advanced and retreated. Landscapes transformed within a few generations. Oral tradition may have recorded these shifts, preserving warnings and lessons. A myth of a great flood might recall rising seas at the end of a glacial period. A tale of fire from the sky could echo memories of distant volcanic eruptions. While the details may have been mythologized, the core memory offered guidance for living in unstable environments. This blending of myth and practicality is one of oral tradition's strengths. A story can entertain, teach, and preserve knowledge all at once. Its repetition ensures that even young listeners absorb information long before they need it. In this way, oral tradition was both education and archive, a living library carried not in objects, but in voices. The survival of these practices across cultures today strengthens the case that they are ancient. Wherever humans live, stories encode both wonder and instruction. The persistence of this dual role suggests that it has been central to humanity since the Ice Age, ensuring that memory was never lost, even when landscapes changed. What happens when stories are spoken not for a single moment, but across hundreds of generations? The endurance of myth shows that spoken story was more than information. It was a way of framing the human place in the world. Creation tales, ancestral journeys, and stories of transformation appear in every culture studied. Their universality suggests a deep Ice Age origin. These myths likely gave meaning to events that were otherwise inexplicable: storms, eclipses, floods, or death itself. By giving such events a narrative, communities could face uncertainty with coherence, embedding mystery within story rather than chaos. Rituals reinforced these myths, ensuring their survival. A story told in ritual was more than entertainment. It was performance, memory, and belief woven together. Chants repeated at burials, seasonal ceremonies, or initiations allowed myths to become living practices. Archaeological traces, ochre burials, carved figurines, painted caves hint at rituals where story and performance fused. Voices rising in chant would have carried myths from one generation to the next, ensuring continuity even in times of hardship. This continuity extended identity across time. Oral traditions did not simply tell of ancestors, they made them present. By repeating stories, groups invoked their predecessors, binding the living to the dead in an unbroken chain. In this way, oral tradition gave people more than memory. It gave them lineage, a sense of belonging to something larger than the moment. Such belonging was vital in a world where life was fragile and uncertain. The adaptability of oral tradition also ensured its resilience. Myths could change with circumstances while keeping their structure. A tale explaining a flood might be retold in new lands with different rivers, yet retain its moral or symbolic core. This adaptability meant that oral traditions could travel as groups migrated, preserving identity while adjusting to new environments. Modern echoes of these Ice Age practices remain. Epic traditions like those of the Homeric Greeks or the Vedic hymns of India are written records of oral worlds. Aboriginal songlines and Native American myths continue to preserve ancestral knowledge through story. These examples remind us that oral tradition is not a primitive stage abandoned by writing. It is a fundamental mode of human culture, as powerful today as it was in the Ice Age. The voices of our ancestors are gone, yet their echoes remain in the myths we tell, the songs we sing, and the rituals we practice. Oral tradition gave humanity a way to preserve memory across thousands of years without ink or stone. In every story told today, fragments of that ancient continuity survive, carrying the breath of the Ice Age into the present. The echoes of ancestral stories carried through the air for tens of thousands of years, but eventually a new invention would alter their nature forever. What happened when human voices were frozen into symbols that no longer faded with the breath that spoke them? The invention of writing, around 5,000 years ago, marked one of the most profound shifts in the history of communication. Until then, every memory, every law, every myth had lived in the fragile medium of sound. Words could endure only if they were remembered and retold. Writing changed this balance. It gave human speech a body outside the body, anchoring the living voice to marks pressed into clay, carved into stone, or painted on papyrus. The earliest systems were not alphabets as we know them today. In Mesopotamia, scribes developed cuneiform by pressing reed styluses into wet clay, creating wedge-shaped signs. At first, these signs represented simple tallies, numbers for trade, records of grain, lists of livestock. Over time, they grew into complex symbols capable of capturing not only objects but also actions and names. Similar processes unfolded independently in Egypt with hieroglyphs, in China with oracle bone script, and later in Mesoamerica with Mayan glyphs. The transformation these systems introduced cannot be overstated. Oral tradition had always been alive, changing with each telling. Writing froze speech into fixed form. A story scratched into clay would not change unless the clay was broken. This permanence allowed knowledge to span generations without alteration, but it also altered the relationship between humans and their words. A voice once carried only in memory was now caged in symbol. Yet this cage brought new power. Writing expanded memory beyond the capacity of the human mind. Empires could track tribute, laws could be standardized, myths could be canonized. Inscriptions on stone or monuments made words visible to those who could not hear the speaker. The spoken word was no longer bound by presence. It could reach across space and time, carried by marks instead of voices. Archaeology provides striking glimpses of this transition. At Uruk in Mesopotamia, tablets dated to around 3,300 BCE preserve records of goods and trades. In Egypt, the Nama palette combines imagery and hieroglyphs to commemorate kingship. In China, oracle bones from the Shang dynasty preserve divinations inscribed with characters recognizable as ancestors of modern script. Each example shows the same pattern. The living voice captured, held still, and transformed into something enduring, but altered. The arrival of writing did not replace oral tradition immediately. For centuries, the two coexisted. Stories were still told by voice, but some were now reinforced, even fossilized, by writing. This coexistence created tension between the fluidity of oral culture and the fixity of text, a tension that would shape human communication ever after. If writing could freeze words in place, how did this transformation reshape memory, power, and the bond between speaker and audience? One of the greatest changes was in the realm of memory. Oral tradition required constant repetition. Elders, storytellers, and ritual specialists carried knowledge within their bodies, their memories sharpened by rhythm and performance. Writing shifted this burden. Clay tablets or scrolls became external memory, storing lists, treaties, and myths. Human memory could now lean on marks, freeing the mind for new tasks, but also risking forgetfulness. Some scholars of ancient Greece worried that writing weakened memory itself, making people dependent on external records rather than the living discipline of recall. Power, too, was transformed. In oral societies, knowledge was shared through performance. Authority came from the speaker's presence, their ability to persuade, inspire, or remind. Writing changed this dynamic. Words carved in stone carried weight not because of the speaker's voice, but because of their permanence. A king's decree, inscribed on a monument, could outlast the king himself, binding generations to laws they had never heard spoken. Writing centralized authority, making it possible for rulers and priests to extend their reach beyond their own voices. The relationship between speaker and audience also shifted. Oral storytelling was interactive. Listeners could question, respond, or reinterpret. Writing silenced this dialogue. A text could not answer back. It presented words as fixed, not negotiable, creating a sense of distance between author and reader. This distance carried both benefits and losses. Clarity was preserved, but flexibility was diminished. Archaeological evidence illustrates these shifts. In Mesopotamia, cuneiform tablets were used not only for trade, but for epic poetry, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh. These texts preserved long narratives that once would have been oral performances. In Egypt, hieroglyphs decorated tombs with spells and prayers to guide the dead, ensuring that words carried power even in silence. In China, oracle bones recorded questions to ancestors and gods, fixing ritual speech into permanent marks. In each case, writing amplified the authority of words by giving them endurance, yet oral tradition did not disappear. Storytellers continued to perform epics, bards recited genealogies, and myths were retold aloud. Writing existed alongside these traditions, sometimes supporting them, sometimes competing with them. The two modes of communication intertwined, shaping each other. A written text might stabilize a myth, but performers could still adapt it in retelling. This interplay created a new cultural landscape where voice and symbol coexisted, each carrying different strengths. The written cage, then, was both prison and promise. It restricted the fluidity of the spoken word, but it also expanded its reach. Memory was no longer bound to fragile bodies, and power could extend beyond the moment of speech. Writing reshaped humanity's relationship to time, embedding words not only in memory but in matter. What did writing mean for the survival of tradition and myth, when stories once alive in voice were suddenly anchored in unchanging marks? In oral cultures, tradition was a living stream. Each retelling allowed change, adapting stories to new listeners and new times. Writing interrupted this flow. Myths inscribed on clay or papyrus became fixed versions, resistant to variation. This stability preserved detail with remarkable precision, but it also narrowed flexibility. A ritual chant that once shifted with performance could now be locked into canon, its words no longer open to reinterpretation. This shift had far-reaching consequences. Religions, once fluid and diverse, began to crystallize into scriptural traditions. Texts like the pyramid texts in Egypt or the Vedic hymns in India anchored ritual words in permanence. Authority shifted from the storyteller to the scribe, from performance to inscription. The written cage captured myth, ensuring its survival, but at the cost of its living adaptability. Yet the cage also granted myths new endurance. Oral tradition could span centuries, but writing stretched memory across millennia. The Epic of Gilgamesh, carved into clay nearly 4,000 years ago, still speaks today. Without writing, such a story would have vanished with the last voice to recite it. Writing gave myth the power to defy time, to outlast generations, to speak to readers who would never meet the original tellers. The endurance of writing also changed how humans related to death and legacy. A voice could fade, but an inscription could remain. Tombs, stelae, and tablets made words visible to descendants, projecting identity beyond life. Kings and priests inscribed their names and deeds in stone, seeking permanence in a medium stronger than flesh. Writing became not only a record, but a monument, carrying the human desire for memory into material form. Still, the tension between oral and written traditions never vanished. Oral storytelling continued to thrive alongside writing, especially among those without access to literacy. The interplay shaped cultures for millennia. Epics like the Homeric poems were born in oral performance, but later captured in text. Even after inscription, they carried traces of their fluid origins, repetition, formulaic phrases, and rhythms designed for memory. Writing preserved them, but their structure reveals their oral heart. The written cage, then, was not absolute. It confined, but it also preserved. It limited adaptation, but it granted endurance. It altered the relationship between humans and their words, making speech something that could survive without breath. In this transformation, language crossed a threshold. No longer ephemeral, it became matter itself, inscribed into clay, stone, and parchment. By capturing the voice in symbols, humanity entered a new era. The breath of ancestors still lingered in oral tradition, but their words now had another form of life, bound not to memory, but to material. The living voice had learned how to endure silence, preserved in the written cage. The written cage gave humanity a new permanence, allowing words to endure across centuries, but permanence did not stop the voice from multiplying. Once captured in clay and ink, language began to evolve in directions that would carry it far beyond stone tablets or papyrus scrolls. What happens when voices once local and fragile grow into thousands, then spread across continents until they form the global chorus we hear today? The centuries after the invention of writing saw languages expand and fracture in tandem. Alphabets simplified the process of recording speech, enabling wider literacy. Greek and Latin scripts spread across Europe and the Mediterranean, while Chinese characters anchored traditions in East Asia and Mayan glyphs preserved knowledge in the Americas. Each system created new archives of thought, freezing once ephemeral voices into forms that could be copied, studied, and shared. Yet even as writing stabilized, spoken languages kept diverging. No matter how permanent the text, the living tongue refused to stay still. The explosion of languages is one of the most striking features of humanity. Today, more than 7,000 are spoken across the globe. Many are descendants of ancient families that first splintered during the Ice Age migrations. Indo-European, Bantu, Austronesian, and Uralic lineages spread over vast regions, their branches carrying echoes of ancestral speech. Each language is both a continuation of the deep past and a unique invention, reshaped by environment, culture, and history. Technology accelerated this process of divergence and preservation. The invention of the printing press in 15th century Europe multiplied voices on a scale never before possible. Text could be reproduced in thousands, fixing local dialects into standardized forms. National languages emerged, anchored by printed Bibles, legal codes, and literature. Yet even as some tongues gained dominance, others persisted in oral form, carrying local traditions in valleys, islands, and mountains. The chorus was layered, some voices amplified, others quiet, all contributing to the soundscape of humanity. The modern age intensified this dynamic further. Telegraphs, radios, and telephones carried voices across distances that once silenced them. For the first time, human speech could leap across oceans in an instant. Languages that had once been confined to a valley could now reach global audiences. Today, digital networks extend this process on a scale unimaginable to our ancestors. Billions of people speak, record, and broadcast daily, their voices preserved not only in memory or text but in audio and video, archived in servers across the planet. What we see, then, is not the silencing of ancestral echoes, but their multiplication. From the single threads of Ice Age lexicons, to the fixed inscriptions of the first scribes, to the vast archives of the digital age, the story of human voices is one of expansion. The echo of the past has become a chorus of the present, vast, layered, and unceasing. If the digital age has multiplied voices beyond anything our ancestors could imagine, how does this new global chorus resemble and differ from the soundscapes of the deep past? In some ways, we have returned to a world of constant contact. During the Ice Age, neighbouring groups met at rivers, valleys, or coasts, borrowing words, gestures and songs. Today, the internet creates a similar dynamic on a planetary scale. Languages once confined to local communities now appear side by side on screens. A post in one tongue may be answered in another. Translation tools make it possible for people separated by continents to exchange words in seconds. The global chorus is not only louder than ever before, it is also more entangled. This entanglement reshapes identity. Just as ancient groups marked belonging through accent or dialect, modern communities do the same with online language. Digital slang, emojis, and memes form new dialects, recognized instantly by those within them and puzzling to outsiders. These modern codes echo the boundaries of Ice Age tongues, showing how language continues to serve as both bridge and barrier. Technology also alters the rhythm of preservation. Oral tradition once relied on memory, writing fixed words in clay or ink. Digital media now records speech itself, preserving accents, tones, and cadences. A song performed by a small community can be uploaded and shared worldwide, ensuring that even endangered languages can find new life. Yet this preservation carries risks. Just as writing once threatened the fluidity of oral tradition, digital archives may freeze languages in ways that change how they evolve. A voice captured in recording is both alive and fossilized. Globalization accelerates the spread of dominant languages. English, Mandarin, Spanish, and Arabic reach billions of speakers, sometimes overshadowing smaller tongues. This mirrors the rise of regional lingua francas in the past, such as Latin, Swahili, or Sanskrit, which enabled communication across large areas. But unlike those earlier cases, today's global languages coexist with thousands of local voices, each adapting, resisting, or blending with the dominant ones. The result is a chorus, both unified and fragmented, an echo of the ancient splintering now playing out in real time. Cultural exchange flourishes within this dynamic. Music, film, and storytelling cross linguistic boundaries, carrying words and rhythms into new contexts. A pop song in Korean may be sung by fans in Brazil. A proverb from Africa may circulate as inspiration in Europe. This circulation mirrors ancient diffusion when neighbouring groups borrowed sounds and myths. The difference now is scale. Where once exchange took centuries, it now unfolds in hours. The global chorus, then, is both ancient and new. It echoes the splintered voices of the past while amplifying them into a planetary symphony. Memory, identity, and exchange continue to shape language, but the stage is larger, the tempo faster, the voices more numerous. Humanity is speaking itself into being once more, only now. The whole world listens. When we step back from the noise of the present, what does the global chorus reveal about the 2 million years of voices that led to this moment? The story begins with breath and rhythm, with the grunts and cries of early hominins walking the savannas. It passes through the chants around fire, the proto-words tied to survival, the shaping of vocal tracts, and the emergence of grammar. It grows into lexicons, myths, and rituals, carried across continents as humanity scattered. It deepens into polyphony, when sapiens shared the world with Neanderthals and Denisovans, each adding their timbre to the Ice Age soundscape. It continues through the splintering of tongues, the endurance of oral tradition, and the invention of writing that caged the living voice in symbol. The present chorus is not separate from this past. It is the latest verse in a song still unfolding. Every language spoken today is a thread tied to the voices of ancestors. Some words may echo Ice Age syllables. Some myths may preserve glimmers of landscapes long vanished. The cadence of chant, the rhythm of story, the lullaby of parent to child, these carry the same functions they once did around ancient hearths. Even the technologies of writing and recording, though new in form, serve the old purpose of preserving memory against forgetting. Yet the chorus today is louder and more layered than ever. Digital voices multiply endlessly. Languages meet and intermingle at a pace unseen in prehistory. The danger of loss remains. Many tongues, spoken by small communities, vanish each year. But there is also resilience. Just as oral tradition endured for tens of millennia, so too do efforts to preserve endangered languages and revive forgotten ones. The human impulse to speak, to name, to tell, has never faltered. Reflection brings us to a deeper truth. Language has never been only a tool, it is the fabric of human becoming. Through it, we shaped identity, carried memory, and imagined futures. Through it, we sang, mourned, and celebrated. Through it, we spoke ourselves into being. The global chorus is not an end, but a reminder that every voice, however small, is part of a continuum stretching back 2 million years. And so, when we listen to the hum of languages around us, to the murmur of conversations, to the stories told in countless tongues, we are hearing more than the present. We are hearing echoes of ancestors, resonances of firelit chants, fragments of myths carried across ice and desert. We are hearing humanity itself, speaking always, changing always, yet never silent. The chorus is us. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for walking the long road from echo to chorus with me tonight. If this story offered you a moment of stillness, sparked wonder, or opened a new question to carry into tomorrow, I am deeply grateful for your time here. I wonder which image or phrase will linger with you as the night settles, a firelit chant carried through the dark, a word pressed into clay that defied forgetting, 1,000 voices rising together across the digital sky. If one of these echoes stayed with you, you're welcome to share it in the comments as a quiet gift to our small community. And if you'd like to journey further, you can like, share, or subscribe, and together we'll step into the next stories waiting in the deep past. Until we meet again, stay curious, stay thoughtful,